Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'm giving you a compilation of the 4 videos I did responding to Mike Winger. Because this is a combination of 4 separate videos, in order to make the viewing experience smoother, I cut out the intros for videos 2 through 4 and put all the comments of the day segments one after the other at the very end of the video, but aside from there being 4 rapid-fire comments of the day at the end, these videos lent themselves fairly well to being combined like this, so I think it'll go rather smoothly as a single video. But I will still leave a link to the playlist if you want to watch them separately. So with that out of the way, let's go! Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'm starting a short series responding to a video put out by Mike Winger, in which he reads through an article on the blog site Allocation called 3 Famous Atheists and Their Best Arguments. Now, Mike and I can both agree that it's not a terribly well-written blog, and it makes several mistakes about the arguments that the author's relying on, but Mike's responses are, at the very least, inadequate, so I'm going to go through and give my thoughts on them. Mike's video came from a live stream, and as such is him going off the cuff and unscripted. Because of this, there are a lot of unrelated tangents and unnecessary fluff, as well as him just bragging about all the hours and hours worth of content he's made on specific topics.
Hours and hours and hours of details. It's like 4 hours of content. Video down below that's over 3 hours.
So I cut a lot out of this. The link to the original is in the description, so you can go ahead and watch the whole thing to make sure I'm not unfairly decontextualizing anything, but the original stream was an hour and 23 minutes long, so even after I cut it down, it was still about 35 minutes, and that's a big video to respond to in one go, so this will be a 4-part series broken up into the various arguments that Mike is responding to. Today we're going to be dealing with that whole Christians are atheists about thousands of gods, atheists just go one god further thing that usually gets attributed to Ricky Gervais, but as far as I can tell, it originated with Dawkins and the God Delusion. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to point out that this is more of a rhetorical device than an argument, with the intention seeming to be to encourage an examination of your epistemological justification for your religious beliefs. But a lot of people, both atheist and Christian, misunderstand this. Anyway, that's enough preamble. Let's get on to the video!
Here we go. This is the article. He says, quoting Richard Dawkins from his book, The God Delusion, "We are all atheists about most of the gods that humanity has ever believed in. Some of us just go one god further." Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. So the first argument is this: we're all atheists.
Yeah, so like I said, not really an argument as much as a provocative statement meant to encourage you to examine why you believe what you believe. I don't recall if that's exactly how Dawkins was using it, and honestly, I don't particularly care. But that is my read on it when it's removed from its context, like it usually is, and that does track with how Dawkins usually works. Hell, just look at the title of the damn book it's from, The God Delusion. If you don't think that was intentionally inflammatory, then I honestly don't know what would count towards that for you. Also, just a blanket disclaimer here. I am speaking for myself, not Dawkins and not the author of the blog post. I'm not defending Dawkins or the author of the post. I'm tackling this from my perspective.
Really 2 issues, 2 very different issues that are overlapping in this first argument. We're all atheists. The assertion is, number 1, there is little difference between monotheists and atheists.
Well, no, it's not that there's little or no difference. It's that when you apply your reasons for not believing in other religions, an unbiased application of these reasons will frequently work for whatever religion you do believe in as well.
There's very little difference, right? We just believe in one less god than you. You're practically an atheist. In fact, he even says we're all atheists.
And that's the provocative part of the provocative statement. Many religions demonize atheists to an even greater degree than the followers of competing religions. So to call an adherent of one such religion effectively an atheist serves as a shock. That's not a label they'd ever voluntarily associate with. It likely has some pretty massive stigma in their minds, so the hope in making such a statement is not with the goal of redefining atheism to include people who believe in one god, but to shock those people into deeper thought. Now, whether or not this is actually effective is a matter of debate, and personally this is not a statement that I would generally find useful to make, but to argue about definitions instead of addressing the point that's being made is less useful than the original statement.
The second issue, we'll cover them one at a time, but the second issue is going to be, if you have consistent standards, hey Christian, hey Buddhist, hey whoever you are, if you had consistent standards, then the reasons you have for rejecting other religions would make you reject your own religion.
That's actually the main thrust of the statement rather than the secondary, but basically yes. You stated it in more absolute terms than I would, with a more certain conclusion, but that is the core of it.
So first, let's deal with the first issue. Is it true that Christians just believe in one more God than the atheists?
No. Y'all actually believe in at least 3 more gods than the atheists, with 4 being common. The Trinity, despite apologist protestations to the contrary, is essentially 3 gods. Then you've got your malicious god, Satan. And a good argument could be made that the more than 10,000 saints recognized by the Catholic Church are demigods. But if you ask a typical Christian, they will tell you that they believe in 1 God. Atheists believe in 0. So to answer your question, 1 is more than 0. So yes, it is true.
And that's a small issue. That's a small thing, right? It's just one less God.
No, that's not it at all. It's not about how big of a deal one God is versus however many other gods might be believed in, or how few gods atheists believe in. All it is a statement that's meant to get you thinking about why you believe in that one God. Not to dismiss that one God because it's just one, and you've already dismissed thousands of others, so what's one more?
Believing in one God literally is the difference between atheism and monotheism.
Thanks, Mike. I never would have figured that out if you hadn't explained it.
So, if that's the whole difference, then how can one say you're basically an atheist when the only defining attribute that keeps you from being an atheist is present in your life?
Like I said earlier, arguing about definitions instead of addressing the point is an incredibly useless endeavor. The point in using the word atheist is purely for shock value, not technical accuracy.
It's just snark and shallow thinking. Not only that, but if you do believe in God, it radically affects your entire worldview. Because atheists who say it's just one less God and act like it's a small thing will also go on to talk about the virtues of atheism and how once they shed themselves of their horrific belief in God, they were freed from it. Well, they obviously think belief in God is a big deal when they say things like that. So how can it all of a sudden not be a big deal?
Literally nobody said that belief in God is no big deal. Not even the poorly written article that you're responding to. You're fighting against a complete straw man, and this isn't even a difficult point from an apologist perspective. All you needed to do was to point out that this doesn't work as an argument because it's not one, and then explain your epistemological justification for believing in Christianity rather than in another religion, and you would have been done. But no, instead you gotta fight against a definition that nobody holds.
It's just snark and shallow thinking.
This line almost short-circuited my brain. A good chunk of what I've been cutting out from Mike's video is him being snarky for no apparent reason. And thinking doesn't get any shallower than accidentally fighting against a straw man of a position when it would have been way easier for him to just directly answer that position.
Now let's deal with the second issue, the street epistemology side. And that is that consistent standards would make you reject all religions. Let me explain to you guys how this works. I come to you, let's say I'm the atheist, you're the Christian, and I come to you and I say, Christian, tell me this. Why do you reject Thor? Tell me the reasons why you reject Thor. And I start to say things like, well, there's no evidence for Thor. And then you say, aha, and that's why I reject Christianity.
And that's valid. I mean, I'd rephrase it to say insufficient evidence rather than no evidence, because just as I'm sure you'd use the Bible as evidence for Christianity, someone who believes in a literal Thor could use lightning as evidence for Thor. Like, yeah, we know it's an electric discharge, but it's a discharge that's governed by Thor. Remember, science explains the how, Thor explains the why.
And then I say, well, why do you reject Hinduism? You say, well, because they don't have any sort of real revelation from God. And I say, ha, and that's why I reject Christianity.
Well, a Hindu might take issue with that, responding by saying that Hinduism is about self-realization rather than revelation, where one must have a personal experience with the truth set out in the Vedas and other sacred texts and teachings, and Christianity offers no equivalent to that, thus making Hinduism the superior religion. Christians like to cherry-pick certain aspects of their religion that they think makes it look more unique than other religions, and then pretend that those aspects are fundamental to how you would judge a religion to be true, like personal revelation from God. But a Hindu would disagree that such things are necessary to determine truth. So who is to be the arbiter here?
So I just apply whatever you say. And what's interesting about this is this: no thinking is required. What some of the differences are between, say, Hinduism, or let's take their example, Thor worship, right? Part of the whole pantheon and believing in Thor and all those different gods. What's the difference between that and Christianity? Here are a few differences that I jotted down, and I've got links in the description I'm going to share with you as well.
Just keep this section in mind as we go through it. There's a reason he went with a belief in Thor rather than Hinduism.
That let you follow up with these things. So the first one is cosmological arguments. So cosmological arguments, and by the way, let me just preface this. If you're the atheist and you're thinking, Mike, those have all been debunked. Haven't you seen rationality rules? And I'm like, Yeah, oh, I've seen it. They haven't been debunked. Like, you're still on the bottom rung, guys.
And there's some of that snark that I've been cutting out. It's not that all the cosmological arguments have been debunked. It's that when you update the cosmological arguments to take our modern understanding of physics and cosmology into account, they lose their kick, essentially getting us to a cause for the universe, but then not concluding anything about that cause. Even before Einstein came along and revolutionized our understanding of the universe, the arguments would often jump from things like necessary being to, and that being is God, without explaining why it has to be a being or why this being was God. It just is.
They haven't been debunked. Do a little more research on this, please, I beg you.
I have. When you talk to a cosmologist about the origin of the universe, they have no problem leaving God out of the equation. It's in the realm of philosophy where it's suggested that a God is necessary for the existence of the universe, and in my experience, nothing illustrates this quite like Sean Carroll's debate with William Lane Craig.
The discussion we're having tonight does not reflect a debate that is ongoing in the professional cosmology community. If you go to cosmology conferences, there's a lot of talk about the origin and nature of the universe. There is no talk about what role God might have played in bringing the universe about. It is not an idea that is taken seriously.
Also worth mentioning is that about 73% of philosophers either accept or lean towards atheism, as opposed to about the 14% who accept or lean towards theism, according to a 2009 survey. So even in the realm of philosophy, where famously you can find philosophical justification for pretty much any stance you care to hold, nearly 3/4 of philosophers either are atheist, or at the very least lean more towards atheism than theism as an adequate explanation for things. And while I'm sure that they would prickle at the word debunked to describe a philosophical argument, it seems reasonable to me to assume that these 73% of philosophers would agree that there are good reasons to not accept the cosmological arguments for God.
Because it's the derision towards Christianity that keeps you as an atheist.
Says the guy who seems to have nothing but derision for atheism. And let's also not forget here, now I understand he's not talking to all atheists, but for me personally, it was my love of Christianity that ultimately led to me becoming an atheist. Because I studied it and did a deep dive into its inner workings to figure out how I could make the things make sense, and then they didn't make sense.
You won't think deeply about it, because why should you? Because you hate it. And I know that doesn't represent everybody, but it does represent a lot of the bottom rung atheists, right?
I don't think that it does. Now, certainly there is plenty of vitriol and bad argumentation coming from the atheist side of things, but in my experience, most atheists are former Christians who stopped believing largely because they were putting more thought into Christianity than the Christians in their community, resulting in them having questions that went unanswered or inadequately answered, leading to their eventual disbelief. Now, obviously, this is not universally applicable. My experience has been shaped largely by my culture. I wouldn't expect atheists in India to be mostly former Christians, for example, as Christianity isn't the majority religion in India. But this has been my experience here, and this experience holds true even for the person who wrote the blog that you're responding to. On another blog, he has a post explaining why he's no longer religious, and it basically boils down to several questions which his family and pastors were either unable to answer, or to which the answers were less than satisfactory. So really, the fact that such bottom-rung arguments, as you call them, could work at all on someone who is in a heavily Christian environment is an indictment against Christianity.
Well, there's cosmological arguments, and there's plural. There's a bunch of these, but one example is the Kalam cosmological argument. By the way, the Kalam cosmological argument, or cosmological arguments in general, they don't work for Thor.
And this is the reason I think he went with Thor instead of Hinduism. Because Thor isn't a creator god, so of course the question of what created the universe doesn't work for Thor. Odin, however, did create the universe out of the dead body of the father of the frost giants, so it does work for Odin. It also works for Hinduism. There are several creation stories in Hinduism, and it's stressed that these are not meant to be strictly literal, but one element that is common in several of them is that Vishnu had a lotus flower grow out of his navel, from which emerges Brahma, who then creates the world. Essentially, any religion that has a creation story can use any of the cosmological arguments. And that's part of the weakness of the argument. It doesn't get us to a specific god, it just gets us to a creator. The Kalam in particular, though, doesn't even get us to God as the creator, it just gets us to a sufficient cause, which then leaves the door open for this cause to be natural rather than supernatural. It also assumes a beginning for the universe, which is not something that is certain at this time. And there are several cosmological models that do not have a beginning as would be required by the cosmological argument. Though, interestingly, the bouncing cosmology model that I've made reference to in the past, where our universe is one in an infinite series, with each universe having slightly different properties than the one before it, fits very nicely with the Hindu idea that the universe is created not once, but infinitely, over and over again, with Brahma creating and Shiva destroying.
So this is a legitimate reason why I can reject Thor but embrace monotheism.
Okay, but why do you reject polytheism? There's nothing about polytheism that says one of those gods couldn't have created the universe. And why do you also reject the monotheism of Islam, Judaism, or Sikhism? You pivoting to a god from a polytheistic pantheon who is not regarded as the creator god, while ignoring the fact that this exact pantheon does have a creation story, does not explain why the cosmological argument precludes that pantheon. In fact, it seems more like a bottom-rung apologist attempt at avoiding the question altogether.
Teleological arguments. This is arguments from design, and you could go two different branches on the teleological side. This is to say biology shows evidence of design and intention, and this is whether or not you believe in evolution.
So, what was the intention of the muscles surrounding the human ear, which actively try to rotate the ears towards sounds, but are too weak to actually do so? That doesn't seem like good design to me. And really, if you believe in evolution, what design are you even seeing? At best, God designed us through a process that involves massive amounts of suffering. And the fact that you had to throw a bone to the science-denying portion of your audience really speaks volumes here. Even apologists who accept evolution seem willing to court anti-scientific bullshit if it means keeping their view counts high. Either that, or Mike here is anti-evolution, but he's willing to court the more scientifically minded Christians in order to keep the view count high. Honestly, I have way more respect for apologists who take a firm stance on evolution, either for or against, than I do for the ones who waffle about it for fear of offending part of their base.
You can also run the argument through the laws of physics and through the constants and qualities that we have in the universe itself. The teleology doesn't work for Thor, but it works for God.
Again, it doesn't work for Thor, specifically because Thor is not believed by anyone to be the god that created anything. But it would work for any god that is thought to be a creator. At least in as much as it works at all. Personally, I don't find the teleological argument to be even the slightest bit compelling. To say that the properties of the universe are fine-tuned for life is to presuppose that the kind of life that we are familiar with is the only kind that is possible. It also assumes that the properties of the universe could have been something other than they are, which is unknown at this point. And it assumes that our universe is the only one to ever have existed, because if it's possible for other universes to exist before, after, or even simultaneously to ours, and it's also possible for the properties of these universes to be different than ours, then we would only ever expect to find life like ours in a universe like ours. And so it is entirely unremarkable that life like ours evolved in a universe like ours. There's also the fact that an omnipotent God shouldn't need to fine-tune the universe for anything. God can do as he pleases. What does it matter if the strong and weak nuclear forces are such that it would not allow for life? God can make life anyway and sustain it himself. In fact, that would be much better evidence for a God. If we studied the universe and found that everything about it suggested that life should not be possible, and yet here we are impossibly existing, that's great evidence for a God. But that's not what we find. We find that when we study the universe, the kind of life that we are familiar with is entirely possible within it, given the right local conditions. Also, going back to your distinction about how the biological argument supposedly works whether or not you believe in evolution, this version of it most definitely does not, because the whole premise is that our universe is favorable to the development and evolution of life. If God created everything without evolution, then what does it matter if the laws of physics are such that stars can last long enough to fuse the elements that life requires? God would just make whatever elements he needs right then and there.
Moral arguments that God is the grounding for objective moral values and duties. I have a whole playlist of videos by one of my favorite guys, Dr. William Lane Craig.
William Lane Craig, also known as Low Bar Bill.
I thought to myself, and I'm not kidding, I thought, if there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. And so my attitude toward this is just the opposite of Kyle's. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
That's right, one of the most highly regarded Christian apologists flat out states that he lowered his epistemic bar in order to believe the thing that he wanted to believe, which kinda speaks to the whole point of the "I just believe in one less God than you" statement. Why does Christianity get a lower epistemic bar, but other religions have to have a higher one? Craig explains that it's basically because he emotionally connected with the idea that God would personally love him, and that by following the religion, he could spend an eternity with such a being. But Christianity is not the only religion with that message, and that's also not something that everyone will emotionally connect with. So if we set our emotions aside, why does Christianity get a lower epistemic bar? There is no good reason for it, and despite your pivoting to a non-creator God in order to claim that generic arguments don't work for non-Christian gods, they often do.
Yes. Now this is where a lot of atheists go, Mike, when you say moral argument for God, what you're really saying is atheists are immoral. I'm not saying that. Christians are never saying that.
Christians are never saying that? I've personally had Christians in my comments say exactly that. But more to the point, the Bible itself says that. Psalm 14 opens by saying, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds. There is none who does good." Christians often quote the first half of that verse to explain why atheism is foolish, but then these same Christians will turn around and say, as you have here, that atheists can be good people, and usually follow that up by saying that they do that by borrowing from the Christian worldview. Well, the Christian worldview, according to the Bible, should be that atheists cannot be good people. And not just that they will be superficially good but evil in their core, but that they do not do good. There are no atheists who do good deeds. So the fact that I have raised tens of thousands of dollars for my local food bank over the last few years is impossible according to the Bible. And Mike disagreeing with the statement means that he disagrees with the Bible.
But this is the constant, I've had this conversation lots of times. Hey, how do you account for moral values and duties? You're saying I'm immoral, I'm a good person. I'm not saying that. I hate you.
I'd just like to point out that, aside from Mike making it look like he's jerking off a couple of dicks here, this segment where he's making up shit that he claims that atheists would say is in the same video where he says this later on.
Religious people will say, now look at this. I love when people predict how others would respond.
This is why, in my videos, I generally avoid pontificating on what apologists would or would not say, unless I have clips or articles to back up what I'm saying about it. And when I am guilty of it without having specific examples to back me up, such as earlier when I said that I've had Christians in my comments say that atheists are all evil, bad people, I point out that it's people in the comments section, a place known for its bad takes and lack of nuance. And while I can't, in this specific instance today, point to a real comment saying that, because I get thousands of comments and I wouldn't even know what keywords to begin searching for that wouldn't also catch thousands of comments that don't say that, I can point to the verse in the Bible that says that, which I think is actually way more damning.
Actually, I would argue that you are a moral person, maybe not good, but you're at least a moral person, and that is the evidence that we're presenting for God.
What is the distinction between being a good person and being a moral person? This seems like Christian doublespeak to account for their whole everybody is really a horrible person whose horribleness rises to a level where they deserve to be tortured for all eternity because of it, while still acknowledging that the vast majority of people will never do anything even close to something that could justify such a punishment in their lifetime. You might be a moral person who does good things, but every time you get angry, that's just as bad as killing the person that you're angry with. So if you've ever been angry at a category of people, then that's the moral equivalent of committing genocide. Of course, you're still a moral person, so you would never act on that, but thinking it makes you a bad person who deserves hell, because having that thought is just as bad as acting on it. Oh, yeah, and also you didn't even have to have the thought that you'd like to kill them all. The emotion of anger is the moral equivalent to having had that thought. So even if your actual thoughts were more along the lines of, I wish they'd change their mind about that thing, you were angry, so it's just as bad as killing them. I'm gonna have to put that on a list of 10 more things that don't make sense about Christianity for my follow-up to the first one.
At any rate, God can account for this because he is the necessary being. Thor cannot account for this because you can't ground those morals in the person of Thor the way you can with God.
What does it mean exactly to ground your morals in the person of God? Different people have different opinions on morality, so clearly we don't all get our morality from some consistent source. And if we are supposed to get our morality from God, then how do we actually determine that God's morality is actually moral? Why is God automatically the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong? What's more here, you want morality to be objective, but to be objective, it has to not be dependent on a subject. To say that God is the source of morality is merely to swap humans for God as the subject. To be truly objective, morality would have to be independent of God. Saying that morality is grounded in the person of God just strikes me as a lazy way of not even thinking about what morality really is, why we have morality, what's the best way to determine moral behavior, etc., etc. It just answers those questions with God, assumes that that is an answer that is both correct and sufficient, and then hand-waves away the fact that humans disagree about morality all the time with an appeal to the fall. If I say something is moral that you personally agree with, then that's morality that's grounded in God. But if I say something is moral that you disagree with, then the only reason we're even capable of thinking that's moral is because humans are fallen creatures who have been corrupted. Christians who agree that God is the source of morality can't even all agree on morality. Catholics argue that morality points to God in much the same way as Mike does, but there are entire Christian denominations that don't just disagree with the Catholic Church on moral stances, but think that the whole institution is evil, with several claiming that the Church itself is the beast of Revelation. Two groups of people who claim to get their morality from the same source, and yet they don't agree on morality. How is this even possible if God really is the source of morality?
So Thor fails the Euthyphro dilemma, whereas God passes it with flying colors.
Whoa, hold up there, Sparky. You didn't explain how God passes it. You just asserted that morality is grounded in God, and then moved on. The Euthyphro dilemma is, put simply, the question of whether something is morally good because God says so, or if God says it's morally good because it's good on its own merits. And yes, the apologetic response to the Euthyphro dilemma is to say that it's good because God's nature is good, but that's a distinction without a difference. Effectively, it's falling back to the first point. It's morally good because God says so. But even if I grant this, it still leaves us with a problem. How do we mere humans determine what is morally good or bad? Well, since we're fallen enough that we can have moral disagreements with other humans despite all of us having the same moral code written on our hearts, we'd have to then compare our moral opinions and actions with God's nature, which is functionally impossible as God does not make his nature available to us for comparison. The Bible certainly doesn't do that, unless you want to say that slavery is moral according to God's nature, because the Bible explicitly endorses slavery, or that genocides can at least sometimes be moral according to God's nature, as he not only commands genocide multiple times, but once committed the most thorough genocide in history, if we believe the story of Noah's Ark. There's also the interesting fact that research has shown that what someone estimates about God's beliefs on social and ethical issues is mostly determined by what they already believe about that same issue themselves. And in cases where a believer had their mind changed through the course of the study, they reported that God agreed with their new stance. So human beliefs about God's moral opinions match up with their beliefs about their own moral opinions, and when they change their mind about a moral belief, they then correspondingly update their opinion about God's moral beliefs. And it doesn't matter what the specific belief is, this is pretty universal. Given that believers all seem to be under the impression that God fully agrees with them about morality, but that believers frequently have mutually exclusive moral beliefs when compared with each other, how is anyone to say what is really moral or immoral with God as the measuring stick? The measuring stick always seems to line up perfectly with whomever is claiming that it's there in the moment, despite the fact that these people will disagree with other people who also claim to have that same stick. So even if I agree that morality is grounded in God's nature, that still doesn't help us figure out what morality actually is, because by all appearances, God has not made his nature available to us for any sort of moral comparison. And so we're back at secular morality, where most people appeal to a form of consequentialism. And that includes people like Mike here. He does a decent job of pretending like his position is divine command theory, where an action that we might consider to be evil, if committed or commanded by God, is good purely because God is the one committing or commanding that act.
I'm not going to defend God. I'm going to say whatever God does is right. Whatever he chooses to do is right, including killing people.
But even he, at times, slips back into consequentialism when it comes to justifying God's actions that we might find unpalatable.
But what about there's people caught up in those judgments that seem to be innocent, in which case, in my own mind, there's a couple things that I would at least try to work through. One is the possibility that that sometimes, in some scenarios, it might be morally justifiable to even kill an innocent person in a greater context. And so, like if a plane is hijacked and we know that plane's going to be driven into whatever building with thousands of people in it, and we shoot it down, we do so with grief and with sorrow, but we do so justifiably.
That is not morality from God's nature. That is consequentialism. If we don't shoot down the plane, thousands of people may die. If we do, dozens of people will die. Dozens is less than thousands, so the consequences, while still bad, are less bad than if we do not shoot it down. Mike doesn't compare the action of shooting it down or the inaction of allowing it to continue with God's nature. He calculated that the consequences would be worse if it was not shot down than if it is, and then decided on the course of action that had better consequences in his personal subjective opinion.
The resurrection of Jesus is an argument that works for Christianity, doesn't work for Thor, right? Historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. It doesn't work for Thor.
I mean, obviously, but I don't see how the people who believe in Thor would see that as an issue. Hell, in the polytheistic worldview, there are even reasons to believe that Jesus really did come back from the dead, but is not actually the Christian God. He could have been resurrected by a trickster god. He could have been resurrected by a god who thought that the development of a religion around him would benefit their own objectives. He could be a god, just not the god that Christians believe him to be. The possibilities are endless here. And that's if I grant that there is good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus in the first place, which, in my opinion, there is not.
Number 8, prophecy. Prophecy shows that Scripture is inspired by God, that he predicts things ahead of time and then later they come to pass.
If the Bible were written all in one go, and it was verifiably completed before its prophecies were fulfilled, and the prophecies were specific enough to unequivocally be able to tell when they were fulfilled, then you might have a case. But as it stands, the fulfilled prophecies in the Bible seem to be written exclusively by people who were writing later than the prophecies were being made, and had access to those prophecies after the fact, and so could massage their stories to make them fit. So, for example, when the Gospels explicitly state that things happened so that the prophecies may be fulfilled, like Matthew 2:17, 2:23, 4:14, 13:14, 26:54 through 56, 27:9, Mark 14:49, Luke 4:21, 22:37, 24:44, John 12:38, 13:18, 15:25, 17:12, and 19:36, to name a few. That shows that the authors of those books had knowledge of the various prophecies and were actively trying to tie them to parts of Jesus' life, sometimes to ridiculous effect. Like where Matthew 21:7 has Jesus riding 2 donkeys into Jerusalem in order to fulfill a prophecy from Zechariah 9:9, where it says, "Your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Matthew made sure to cover his bases by having Jesus ride both a donkey and a colt at the same time, as only having him on one animal could potentially leave the door open for this prophecy to remain unfulfilled. So when you have authors writing stories of events decades after they would have happened, who were not themselves eyewitnesses to the events, as scholars almost unanimously agree the gospel authors were not, then see them connecting events in the narrative to prophecies that were written hundreds of years before, is not really surprising or impressive. People do that sort of thing with prophecies all the time, and biblical prophecies were often quite vague in their wording, so whether or not they would have been fulfilled is a matter of much interpretation. Even between the Gospels, we see that Mark, Luke, and John seem to consider one colt to be enough to fulfill the riding on donkey prophecy, but Matthew disagreed, adding in the second donkey. And when the Bible does get specific, the prophecies often fail. Like the one about how Tyre, a city that still exists to this day, would be conquered and destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, never to be rebuilt. And while Nebuchadnezzar did lay siege to it and eventually made Tyre a vassal state of Babylon after 13 years of siege, he didn't destroy it, and it's still there today. And then later in that same book, there's a similar prophecy against Egypt. First, that God would make all of Egypt a desolate waste for 40 years, to the extent that no man or beast shall even set foot in it during that time period. And then after the 40 years are up, it will be a lowly kingdom that will be conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. And while you could say that maybe the prophecy against Tyre was a bit hyperbolic, the fact that Nebuchadnezzar won that siege is enough to fulfill it, it remains a fact that there is no evidence at all, historical or archaeological, to suggest that Egypt once spent nearly half a century as a completely uninhabited wasteland, and Nebuchadnezzar never even came close to conquering it. So yeah, the biblical prophecies that have been fulfilled were done so in a way that could be easily contrived by later authors just being familiar with the earlier prophecies, and there are plenty of failed prophecies in the Bible, demonstrating a rather startling lack of prophetic accuracy from a book that's supposed to be the Word of God.
Now, if you think, well, that's just the Bible proving the Bible, you're on the bottom rung.
No, it's not the Bible proving the Bible. It's later authors were aware of prophecies, and so wrote their books in ways that would fulfill these prophecies, which I guess could be oversimplified to using the Bible to prove the Bible, but that's an oversimplification that I try to avoid because it lacks a bunch of nuance.
No, it's documents from history that cover massive amounts of time written by different authors, and we can actually separate the prophetic foretelling from the fulfillment that we can confirm through outside sources. Okay, that becomes something very different than the Bible proving the Bible.
What prophecies do you think were confirmed as fulfilled through outside sources, I wonder? And do you have to assume that a book was written earlier than it was in order to get you there? In fact, there are times when the dates for the composition of biblical texts are arrived at least partially, based on how accurate or inaccurate the prophecies are. Daniel, for instance, gets the general outlines of things mostly correct when dealing with events in the 6th century BCE, the time when it was supposed to have been written according to the text itself. But there are significant errors that would be understandable for an ancient author writing a few centuries after the fact, but are strange coming from someone who lived through that time period, like getting the order of ruling monarchs wrong, their lineages, and even potentially inserting a completely non-existent figure into the mix. But then when prophesying about events that would take place around the 2nd century BCE, 400 years later than it was supposed to have been written, it suddenly becomes significantly more specific and is accurate in its specificity, until a point where the predictions are just flat out wrong. This suggests that the book was written sometime around the 2nd century BCE. It makes sense that someone writing then would have a general but limited knowledge of events from 400 years previously, and then the author was able to write in much more specific terms about his own time, but when actually attempting to predict the future, he failed just as anyone guessing about events would be expected to. So yeah, in this case, you could say that a number of prophecies from Daniel were confirmed as fulfilled through outside sources. But there are several prophecies in that same book that are confirmed to have been inaccurate through outside sources, and the nature of these accuracies and inaccuracies is a part of how scholars figured out that Daniel was likely written in the 2nd century BCE rather than the 6th.
Muhammad had prophesied that in the future, or in the end times, dishes would speak to one another. Now, the idea is, well, this is satellite dishes. This is a prophecy about satellite dishes. Now, I try to have consistent standards. If I saw that prophecy in the Bible, I would never use it, because I would say, why on earth would I have thought at the time that this could refer to satellite dishes?
I've seen the kinds of things that apologists will latch onto as fulfilled prophecy. Hell, you yourself quoted Genesis 3:15 as being a prophecy that speaks of Jesus.
The very first prophecy of the Messiah, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15.
It's not even clear that this verse was written as a prophecy. It seems to be written more as an etiology. It's a part of a story to explain a fact about the world. The fact that it's explaining is why snakes bite people while people try to kill snakes. It's because of the curse of God. Because the snake tricked Eve into eating the fruit, God cursed the snake, saying that he will put enmity between the snake and the woman, with the offspring of the snake biting at the heels of the offspring of the woman, while they try to kill the snake by bashing their heads. But you take that verse and contort it to make it appear to be a prophecy about Jesus, with Jesus being an offspring of the woman through his human lineage, who will defeat Satan by crushing his head, thus offering salvation to humanity. But if the snake is supposed to be Satan, and this verse is supposed to be a prophecy, then what of verse 14, where God is cursing the snake as compared to the other animals, without even giving so much a hint as to its demonic nature? It's not cursed above all the other angels and demons, it's cursed above all livestock and beasts of the field. How does that fit into the prophecy? And if it doesn't, why does it get ignored? So yeah, given that these are the sorts of prophecies that you're willing to accept, forgive me for not believing that you wouldn't use the dish one if it was in the Bible.
This seems to be a modern use of a word that didn't have that ancient use. This is called anachronism, reading into the past something that was never there in the first place.
And what's the issue with that? It's a prophecy, is it not? If accurate prophecy were a thing, would we not expect to find the occasional anachronism, where the prophecy was referring to something which would not have been something that the author could have known about in their time? Hell, your use of Genesis 3:15 as a prophecy referring to Jesus is itself anachronistic. The author of that text himself would not have known about Jesus or Christianity, and there doesn't appear to be any messianic interpretation of that verse outside of Christians anachronistically imposing the interpretation of Jesus onto it. From the organization Jews for Judaism, quote, There is absolutely no reason to assume that Genesis 3:15 is messianic or that the Messiah is to be born in a supernatural way. The phrase "her seed" has nothing to do with the determination of messianic lineage. The woman mentioned is Eve. Her seed is representative of all her future descendants, and the direct reference here is to the hostility between mankind and serpents. There's also the fact that, in the Christian interpretation, the seed of the woman is referring to a specific descendant of hers, while the seed of the serpent is referring to the same serpent who is being spoken to in the passage, not its descendants. Unless Christians believe that the serpent wasn't actually Satan, but was actually one of Satan's ancestors? That would certainly be a weird interpretation that I hadn't heard before, but I've never heard that before.
Well, as you read more and more about Muhammad, you realize he thought that birds could talk to people. He said Solomon had conversations with birds.
And if you read about Jesus, you find that he thought that mustard seeds are the smallest of all seeds, and that they grow up into big trees, neither of which are true.
Editing Rhino here. Yeah, not sure how I missed this during the script writing and recording processes, but yeah, it's kind of amusing to me that he's complaining that Muslims think that birds literally spoke to Solomon, when he's from a religion that believes that snakes spoke to Eve and donkeys spoke to Balaam. There's also the fact that some species of birds actually can speak. I am not aware of any species of donkey or snake that can talk, so really the Muslim claim here is the more believable of the three. Although, to be fair, Islam would accept the other two claims as well because, they believe in the Old Testament too.
He said that Alexander the Great traveled to the edge of the earth where the sun fell into a pool of mud, and there he met a group of people that lived on the edge of the earth where the sun went into the mud.
And in Joshua 10, 12, and 13, the Bible records that the sun stood still at Gibeon and the moon in the valley of Ajalon, thus giving the Israelites more daylight hours during which they could defeat their enemies. The most charitable interpretation here is that the earth suddenly stopped spinning, and God performed one of the biggest miracles of history by stopping the catastrophic destruction that would result from such a sudden stop, and that this massive miracle only gets a passing 5-sentence reference that doesn't even make it clear that such a big miracle took place. But more realistically, the ancient authors of the Book of Joshua didn't know that the Earth is a large oblate spheroid rotating at 1,600 kilometers per hour, while also orbiting the significantly larger Sun, but thought that the Sun was a small, fairly close object that moves through the sky, as is the Moon, and so stopping the Sun would only have the consequence of making the day last longer.
Number 9, I'll offer one that people don't appreciate very much, and they should. Personal experience. Now, I have experienced God in my life. I don't usually offer that as evidence for you, but it's at least evidence for me.
I mean, sure, I'll grant that it counts as evidence for you, but if you're not offering it as evidence for me, then why are you not only presenting it here as though it is evidence, but also saying that people don't appreciate this one very much, but that they should? Why should I appreciate your personal experience when you acknowledge that your experience doesn't even count as evidence for me?
The fact that I have all this evidence for Christianity, this is number 10, is evidence against Thor.
Well, most of the evidence you gave would work for Norse pantheism as well if we don't specifically just narrow it down to Thor, and some even work better for Norse pantheism than Christianity. Many of the problems with the Christian God stem from how powerful Christians claim he is, things like the problem of evil. These problems go away if there's a whole pantheon of less powerful gods. Why is there evil and suffering? Because the gods that want to prevent it can't be everywhere at once, and there are other equally powerful gods who want to cause chaos and destruction, that's why.
Is evidenced against Hinduism, Buddhism, and even atheism.
Not really. How does the cosmological argument not work for Hinduism? All it gets us to is a cause for the universe, and in Hinduism, that cause is Brahma. There are many different flavors of Buddhism, but one common thought among many of them is that the origin of the cosmos is not a question that should be answered with religion. To quote the Buddhist monk K. Sri Dhammananda, the explanation of the origin of the universe is not the concern of religion. Such theorizing is not necessary for living a righteous way of life and for shaping our future life. However, if one insists on studying this subject, then one must investigate the sciences, astronomy, geology, biology, and anthropology. These sciences can offer more reliable and tested information on this subject than can be supplied by any religion. So, yeah, I guess you could technically say that this means that the cosmological argument doesn't work for Buddhism, but given that I'm not convinced that it works for any religion, that doesn't really matter to me.
Right? Evidence for one religion is evidence against competing claims.
Yeah, if it's specific enough, but a lot of the evidence you gave for Christianity wasn't actually specific to Christianity. You just assumed that it was, and moved on with zero justification aside from your personal incredulity. I mean, yeah, there were those bits that I cut out where he links to the hours and hours of other content he has on various subjects, so presumably there will be specifics there, but honestly, the level he's at now seems to be pretty normal for apologists in my experience.
So the phrase that we often hear online, we often hear repeated by skeptics and cynics, that there is no evidence for God, there's no evidence for the Bible, no evidence for Christianity. It's not only not true, but it reveals something, and this might change our approach to those people. It reveals that they have such a shallow understanding of the evidence for God, of the evidence for Christianity, that they are in this incredibly confident state where they feel they can dismissively say that none of it exists.
Either that, or they're just not being explicit in their language, because in my experience, no evidence is usually shorthand for no evidence that I find to be compelling. I agree that there is evidence, but I find it to be incredibly weak compared to what I would expect if the God that is described by the Bible actually existed. Just as you find the dishes talking to each other to be insufficient evidence to convince you of the truth of Islam, I find the fact that stories from the 1st century were written in a way that made them seem to fulfill prophecies written hundreds of years earlier, which the authors of the 1st century stories definitely had access to be insufficient to convince me of the truth of Christianity.
The most popular level of atheism, pop atheism, really does think that none of these evidences exist, or that random YouTubers have utterly refuted them with their 5-minute videos.
You know, I made that dig about Mike bragging about how many hours of content he has on various topics as a fairly minor joke that doesn't matter at all, but I'm beginning to think that apologists might really value quantity over quality. Between him digging at another YouTuber for only making a 5-minute video on it, his bragging about the length of his content, Habermas bragging for years about how many hundreds and thousands of pages he's writing on his minimal facts argument, and how frequently apologists will talk about how high the pile would be if you put all the biblical manuscripts we have in one stack, it's hard not to draw that conclusion. If it only takes 5 minutes for someone to explain why they don't find an argument or a piece of evidence compelling, then why is that a problem? Would my position suddenly become more tenable in your eyes if I point out that my videos have gotten so long recently that a couple weeks ago I referred to a half-hour-long video as being on the shorter side, and then point to a playlist that I may have that has hours and hours of content of me explaining why various religious arguments aren't convincing to me, which run the gamut from the young earth creationism of the likes of Ray Comfort and Matt Powell, to the old earth creationism of Frank Turek, to the Catholicism of Brian Holdsworth and Father Casey, to the pop apologetics of J. Warner Wallace and Mike Winger. Yes, Mike, I consider you to be in the bottom rung pop apologetics category, despite the considerable length of your content. You speak with such derision of the random YouTubers making 5-minute videos refuting arguments for God, but you yourself are basically just a random YouTuber doing the exact same thing, just with longer videos and in the other direction. As far as I can see, you are no more qualified to speak on these subjects than I am. Both of us have the exact same credentials here. We are ordained ministers, and nothing more. The YouTubing is essentially a hobby that grew into a career. So now it's literally my job to research these topics as thoroughly as I can, and then break them down into language that is more easily digestible for people who don't want or have time to dig through all the materials for themselves. But you won't catch me throwing shade at other people for being YouTubers as though I think I'm better than that for some reason. I have done it a couple times, but that always comes with a self-deprecating jab because I know what I am. Also, I got curious at this point about what Rationality Rules video on the Kalam he was talking about, and he did publish a video that's a little over 5 minutes that did talk about the Kalam cosmological argument just a few months before Mike published this video, and what I find interesting here is that Mike presented it as though it was supposed to be seen by atheists as a thorough and complete destruction of the argument, rendering the whole thing moot. But that's not what it is, not by a long shot. It's an explanation as to why he doesn't think that the Kalam version of the argument is compatible with libertarian free will, and he even explicitly says at the end of his video that he doesn't think this is the end of the Kalam.
This isn't some haymaker against the Kalam or libertarianism, but so far as I can tell, it is a haymaker against those who insist on the soundness of both.
So this random YouTuber, who's the only one you singled out by name, so I assume that this is what you're talking about, would completely disagree with you saying that he thinks he has utterly refuted this argument in his short little video. And you being dismissive while misrepresenting the other side makes you look like you don't actually have a good response to the other side. Now, sure, the people who only watch your videos aren't likely to notice that that's what you're doing, but anyone in your audience who is curious about what Rationality Rules could have said in such a short video that's supposed to have utterly refuted the Kalam argument, and so goes to his video to see what all the fuss is about, is going to see that it's not even close to being what you claim it to be. They will then be less inclined to trust you in the future, and I can definitely see how that could plant the seeds of doubt that will result in them losing their faith. My own first seed of doubt was way less significant than a popular apologist being caught misrepresenting the other side. It'd be like that proverbial pebble in their shoe. They're still Christian and still watching apologetics content, but now every time you come up, they'll have this nagging feeling that you might be misrepresenting the positions that you're arguing against, because they've seen it happen before. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying here is, go ahead and keep setting up the straw men for you to knock down. You'll make more atheists that way than if you're honestly engaging in the conversation. Good work!
Realize there's more to think about here than what you've realized. You had an unthinking Christianity, and then you went and moved to an unthinking atheism through slogans and bad reasoning. And I think that represents a large number of people.
You guys are a bunch of thoughtless chumps. That's why you should come back to Christianity. Do you really think that being condescending is going to reach anyone?
All right, let's look at number 2. Number 2 is about indoctrination. And this is a quote also from Richard Dawkins. Second argument from Richard Dawkins. We'll then move on to other top atheists in his view. Do not indoctrinate your children. Teach them how to think for themselves, how to evaluate evidence, and how to disagree with you.
I don't disagree with that statement. Kids should be allowed to disagree with their parents on matters that don't impact their immediate health and safety. But of course, as a parent, there are times when it is appropriate to run the household as a dictatorship, both because of practicality and because of health and safety. The kids aren't allowed to disagree with me about the importance of washing their hands after using the toilet, for example, no matter how much they may want to. Well, I mean, they're allowed to have a dissenting opinion about it, but their behavior in that case must conform to my opinion. And while I do try to explain the reasoning behind it, at the end of the day, whether I change their minds or not doesn't matter. The hands get washed.
It's ultimately based on an assumption. I see an assumption here. The assumption is, I don't know if you caught it, that there are two mutually exclusive options for parents. Either you teach them that a religion is true, or you teach them to think critically.
Well, that's not entirely the case, but often what I've seen is that when critical thinking is taught in a religious household, the religion is usually the special exception. We can think critically about pretty much anything, but if you start to doubt the evidence for God or the resurrection or creation or whatever else, then that is when you just have to have faith. There are many atheists that I know where this disconnect is, at the very least, a part of what started them on the path to atheism.
And the two are incompatible. You view religion through such lenses of bitterness, all religion, right? All religion. And there's plenty of people like this that feel the same way, that you can't reason carefully about it.
Once again, we have Mike commenting on the internal lives of people that he disagrees with as though he actually has any insight there. Dismissing arguments against religion as just being the result of bitterness is a huge part of this whole you're allowed to think critically about anything as long as it doesn't call the religion into question thing. You aren't thinking critically about the arguments against your religion, you are being dismissive by attributing motivation to them that isn't necessarily there. Now, are there atheists that are bitter towards their former religions and potentially all religions? Sure, but that doesn't mean that religions don't engage in indoctrination. I'd actually wager that a good chunk of the bitterness that is there is a result of someone realizing that they had been indoctrinated and resenting the people responsible for it. Because here's the thing. If you convince me with data and evidence that your religion is true, I won't be bitter about my time spent as an atheist. I will be happy to have learned a true thing. As an atheist who is interested in science, nothing is more exciting to me than finding out that I was wrong about something. If I find out that I was wrong, that means I learned something new, and learning is fucking great. But as a Christian, learning new things could only be good if it either had nothing to do with Christianity or did not contradict Christianity. As soon as a doubt is expressed, fellow Christians get upset, dismissive, and sometimes go on the attack. And not too long ago, I responded to a different video that Mike had where he did exactly that to someone who is expressing doubts and asking Mike for help. Mike ended up questioning the person's sincerity in a way that, if it had happened to me when I was a believer, would have been incredibly hurtful and would have hastened my deconversion. He all but outright called the questioner a liar. If that person ends up as an atheist, then I completely understand why they might have bitterness towards a religion that caused the people who are supposed to help to instead attack them and call them a liar for having doubts in the first place. But guess what? That bitterness will not be what made them an atheist. In that specific case, it will be divine hiddenness. The fact that the Bible promises several times that if you sincerely seek God, he will reveal himself to you, and then after sincerely seeking God, there was no revelation.
It's like if you've ever had someone you really hated, and then they did something very nice. and you had to find a reason why the nice thing was actually bad.
I don't know that hate is the appropriate emotion there, but I certainly have experienced someone I don't like doing something admirable. While I may be more primed in such a case to look for ulterior motives, if the thing itself is admirable, I have no problem giving credit where it's due. And this is evidenced by the fact that I have, when I feel it is justified, given praise to apologetics organizations when they do something praiseworthy. For instance, in a video where I responded to an organization called Juice TV Network, I went out of my way to praise the fact that they have a video on their channel that I did not respond to, which explains that mental health care should not be stigmatized. It should be seen as the same as physical health care, and that included medication. There are medications that can help with certain mental health conditions, and these medications often have a very high stigma associated with them, and often that stigma is even higher in religious groups than in non-religious ones. I've experienced that myself. I take Vyvanse for ADHD, and I've had people in my comments on videos where I talk about it flat out tell me not to take it. Now, this hadn't happened yet when I made that video, but I appreciated that this apologetics organization advocated for science-based medical health care rather than engaging in the victim blaming that so many apologists resort to. And as an atheist, there is no reason for me not to praise praiseworthy things about people I disagree with. I don't have a book that says that all Christians are fools who do abominable deeds. There are none who do good. So when I see a Christian doing good, even if it's an apologist who I have very strong moral disagreements with, that's not an issue.
I did the video, and then I had an atheist respond to my video after asking me for it, where I condemned Steven Anderson. And the response was some popular atheist, I don't remember his name, doing a video explaining how Mike Winger might look like a good guy here, but just so you know, he's just as crazy as Steven Anderson. He's just the nicer looking version of crazy. Let's make sure we know he's still a villain.
While Mike is saying that he doesn't remember who it was, I'm fairly certain that it's referring to a Prophet of Zod video on the topic. That was the only video I could find from it from any of the main atheist YouTubers that I'm aware of. And what's interesting is that Mike is framing this as though Zod had been asking him to make that video, and then after making the video, the very people who demanded it turned around and said, well, I still don't like him because he's a bad guy in these other ways. This has a couple of issues. First, I happen to know Zod, so I messaged him to ask if he has ever asked Winger to make such a video, and the answer was a fairly definitive no. So while it is entirely possible that he was getting comments asking for him to address Anderson, I feel like that probably would have been more from Christians wanting another Christian to put some distance between himself and Anderson, rather than atheists really wanting to know Winger's position regarding the biblical accuracy of Anderson's position. But yeah, who knows. Second, that summary was a complete misrepresentation of Zod's video. It wasn't, I don't like Mike, so I have to find a way to make him the villain even when he does something good. It was more along the lines of, both Winger and Anderson are using the Bible to justify their position, so why should something as important as should we exterminate LGBTQ people be left up to the interpretation of a book that could go either way, rather than just landing on don't do that out of a respect for basic human dignity?
And that's the whole response, right? Like I can't do anything possibly positive.
The supposedly positive thing that you're thinking of here is thinking that LGBTQ people are wicked sinners who deserve eternal torture, but you are against implementing the death penalty for them. So yeah, you don't get to be called a good boy and get a little pat on the hat for having such a shitty opinion, but drawing the line at extermination of a group of people you don't like, especially when you arrive at that conclusion from a perspective of, I don't think this 2,000-year-old book really wants us to exterminate them, but if I thought that it did, then I'd totally be on board.
Is it possible to teach critical thinking and the truth of a religion?
Yes, but best case scenario here, you're going to wind up raising a kid that has severe cognitive dissonance about it.
Yes, why not?
Well, to put it bluntly, because applying critical thinking skills to a religion will, in my experience at least, leave you with no reason to believe that religion. Now, is there a religion out there that will stand up to critical examination that I just haven't heard of? It's possible, I guess, but every religious philosophy that I have heard of and examined for myself doesn't really cut the mustard. And specific to Christianity, there is no shortage of apologists admitting that the emotional reasons for believing are stronger than the logical ones.
Learn to circumnavigate or go around the person's intellect, the place of argument, and to speak directly to their conscience.
I didn't want to resist. I had a hunger to give in to this.
The Kalam cosmological argument, I go, that's a really good argument for God's existence, but I don't know how much it strikes people's emotions. I look at the moral argument and I go, that one hits people's emotions and it's intellectually strong as well.
Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it. I think that this is a message which is so wonderful, so fantastic, that if there's any evidence that it's true, then it's worth believing in.
The only reason why you could say it's not, why you would say this dichotomy exists, this mutually exclusive category of teach religion or teach critical thinking, why you could keep those apart is only if every religion is false and based on lies.
Congratulations, Mike, you figured it out! Gold star! Yeah, so this is an instance of one of those things where, yes, every religion could be false, but not every religion could be true.
But that's only true if atheism's true.
Remember, he is ostensibly responding to an article written by an atheist here. He's supposed to be explaining the problems with the atheist arguments. To admit that the argument makes perfect sense and totally works if atheism is true doesn't exactly help you with that.
Do you catch the circularity of this?
What circularity? Through critical thinking, I have realized that atheism is true, so when raising my kids, I don't need to worry about teaching them to believe anything in particular about religion. I just need to teach them critical thinking skills, and then if they apply them properly, they'll arrive at the same conclusion as I have, all on their own. That's not circular in the slightest. Now, I'm sure there are atheist parents out there who have just flat out told their kids that God doesn't exist, but as for me, I've done my best to go through the teach critical thinking route, and at least one of my kids has decided on their own that they don't believe in God. The other two I could see going either way, but given that the last time their grandmother took them to church, they said that they really enjoyed it because there were snacks, I feel like the critical thinking bit hasn't quite taken hold yet, but neither has a religious influence. They just go where their stomachs lead them. Not the best path to truth, but at least they won't go hungry on the way.
If atheism's true, you have a choice to teach your kids critical thinking or religion. If atheism's not true, you can absolutely teach religion and critical thinking at the same time.
Here's the thing though. Kids aren't capable of critical thinking to the same degree as adults. Their limbic system develops well before the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system is the part of the brain that is more likely to respond to strong emotional stimuli. Fear, pleasure, anger, things like that. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that basically keeps the limbic system in check. Yes, eating this whole bag of chips is going to taste good now, but it's not going to help me stay healthy, and I'll probably feel slightly sick for a while afterward, so I'll portion it out reasonably instead of eating straight from the bag and being done with it before I even notice. The limbic system develops much quicker than the prefrontal cortex, which, for simplicity's sake, we can say doesn't fully develop until around age 25, with the understanding that neuroscience is complicated and our brains never really fully develop. They are always capable of change and growth. Fully matured, let's say. That leaves the door open for continual development, while still pointing out that there is a definite developmental point at which parts of the brain are not capable of performing optimally. So, given that the part of the brain that responds strongly to emotional stimuli matures well before the part of the brain that keeps it in check, and that we just watched a montage of apologists talking about how important it is to appeal to emotions in apologetics, then it seems like the best way to make sure that kids are actually making decisions that are the result of critical thinking rather than being emotionally driven is to wait until they're adults before presenting them with such decisions. The best way to accomplish that, specific to this discussion, is to hold off on teaching them that a particular religion is true until they're in their mid-20s, while reinforcing critical thinking skills the entire time leading up to that. If there is a true religion out there, then it should easily withstand scrutiny at that point. But if a religion requires you to, say, train up a child in the way he should go so that when he is old he will not depart from it, rather than waiting until they're capable of critically evaluating religious claims, then that is evidence that that religion won't actually stand up to a critical evaluation of its claims.
Now, indoctrination has different definitions. Here's one definition of indoctrination, and I'll put it on screen. Teaching someone to fully accept the ideas, opinions, and beliefs of a particular group, and not to consider the other ideas, opinions, and beliefs, or the ideas of other groups.
That seems like a decent definition. And it's one that includes how Christian parents typically teach about religion. I doubt very much that Mike here would approve of Christian parents teaching their young kids to consider the possibility that Islam might be true, or Hinduism, or Buddhism, or even, heaven forbid, atheism.
So don't even think about it. Just adopt it, believe what we're saying, don't think about or even consider other people's ideas. Now, if that's what you mean by indoctrination, then that's something that happens on a human level. It's not a religious thing.
Excuse me? Are you trying to claim that Christians encourage their kids to consider the possibility that Christianity might be wrong? Or are you just doing that thing where you're making excuses for the way Christian parents behave by saying, well, everybody's doing it?
It certainly happens In an atheist community,
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend that all atheist parents are like me. I'm sure there are some who teach their kids that there is no God rather than relying on them to come to that conclusion for themselves. But there's not a massive problem in North America of atheists kicking their kids out of the house for converting to Christianity. There is, however, quite a large problem with Christians kicking their kids out of the house for leaving Christianity or for being LGBTQ. I get messages from such people on a semi-regular basis, and my advice is always the same. If your having a place to live is dependent on you being Christian, then just lie. Pretend to be a Christian until you can get out on your own. Yeah, it'll fucking suck, but better to live a lie for a few years than to end up in a desperate situation because of intolerant parents. Now, that's not the kind of advice that a Christian apologist will ever need to give to the child of atheist parents, and it honestly breaks my heart that there are kids that have to go through that.
where we won't even really consider the arguments of other people being presented. We'll just look for the quickest rebuttal and run away from them as quick as possible.
Well, that is certainly how I lived as a Christian. After my doubts started, I had to actively avoid certain topics because the apologists didn't have good arguments backing up their claims, so rather than having to tolerate bad arguments being made on my side, I just avoided those subjects entirely. As an atheist, I probe my kids with questions when they bring up religion, letting them reason through it for themselves, encouraging them to figure out why it is that they believe what they believe. And I will love and support them no matter what conclusion they come to at the end of it, because I don't have a worldview that requires them to come to the same conclusion as me.
You aren't even thinking like you think you're thinking, but you're not.
Do you know what this is, Mike? This is for you. This is a self-own. Get it? Because it's a cell phone and it's a self-own.
Now, if you mean by indoctrination just teaching your kids things, yeah, we should all do indoctrination in that sense, but really nowadays most people mean something else by it. They mean kind of like thought control that prevents people from reasoning. And that I'm opposed to, which should be obvious.
It should be, but it's not, Mike. It is very much not obvious. I literally watched you attack and gaslight one of your own viewers who asked you a sincere question hoping for a good answer, rather than considering the possibility that they might have sincerely had doubts about their faith as a result of God's hiddenness. Those are not behaviors that would be expected of someone who is against thought control that prevents people from reasoning.
And by the way, Christianity has had some of the greatest critical minds of all time. Right? And most of the great thinkers in the past have been religious people.
I like how you had to pivot from Christianity had some of the greatest critical minds to most great thinkers of the past have been religious people. Probably because you know that when most people think of great thinkers of the past, they default to people like Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, rather than people like Aquinas or Anselm. And given that much of Christian apologetics involves repackaging ancient Greek philosophy into a new Christian-friendly skin, that makes sense. But also, in the past, before we learned about just how powerful science was as a tool for understanding how the universe works, it made a lot more sense to believe in a god or gods keeping everything going. But today, among professional philosophers, 67% accept or lean towards atheism, with another 7% calling themselves agnostic, and only 19% saying they accept or lean towards theism. So the great thinkers of the time before science figured out how nature could do shit without a god believed in a god, but the great thinkers of today seem perfectly happy to, for the most part, leave God out of the equation altogether.
He says the child will choose whether or not religion is true and real, rather than constantly being told by trusted family and friends that it is. Kids don't choose what's true and real, right? None of us choose what's true and real because we believe in objective truth and objective reality, which means I'm discovering truth, I'm not choosing it.
You're splitting hairs over nothing here. Obviously that's meant to be choose what to believe is true and real, rather than choose what is actually true and real. Now, there are different kinds of truths, and apologists like to use that fact to cast shade on non-Christians thinking that truth is relative. But generally speaking, relative truth would be something more along the lines of your opinion about a movie. In my opinion, The Core is a fantastic movie. That is true for me because I thoroughly enjoyed watching it. It may not be true for others, and considering its 39% critic score and 34% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, I'm gonna go ahead and say confidently that my truth is not a universal truth in this instance. Though, to be fair, I loved it so much because of how bad it is. I laughed way harder at several scenes in The Core than I've ever laughed at any intentionally funny movie. But when it comes to statements of fact about reality, while the perception of such facts can be confused by our imperfect senses, the facts themselves are objective. If God exists, then that would be an objective fact about reality. People could believe it to be true or believe it to be false, but their belief will not impact the actual truth value of the statement God exists. Now, personally, my issue with the statement about choosing your beliefs is the idea that we choose our beliefs. I didn't choose to stop believing in God, but a thorough examination of the evidence left me unconvinced of God's existence, and so despite my best efforts to continue believing, I stopped believing. People cannot choose what they do or do not find convincing or compelling. That's why two people can look at the Kalam cosmological argument and come to two different conclusions, one thinking it's fantastic evidence for God, and the other wondering how things that begin to exist have causes even gets you to a God rather than just a sufficient cause. I believed in Christianity because I grew up with it and was emotionally invested in it. At no point in my life did any Christian encourage me to examine why I believed it. It was always just assumed to be true. And so when I finally got around to examining it, I found that the evidence was unconvincing. What those of us who advocate for raising your kids without indoctrination would want is for kids to be taught at a young age to examine their reasons for their beliefs rather than just assuming them to be true. And the more impact a belief has on your life, the more important it is that you know why you hold that belief. And if you don't have confidence that kids will be able to come to a belief in Christianity using this method without having to be told from a young age that it is true, then that is a rather severe indictment of Christianity in my opinion. And no, just for the record, I'm not advocating for kids to be taught that atheism is true either.
Now, if kids could choose what's true, indoctrination would be entirely appropriate. I could just tell you it's true, and then you choose it, and now it's true because you chose it. So all that would matter is getting people to choose things.
I wonder if he's being obtuse on purpose, or if he really thinks that that's what's being said by the article. It's hard to tell. Mike is either extremely comfortable with lying, or his reading and listening comprehension skills are complete garbage. Because this isn't the first time I've seen him misunderstand something so obvious to such a severe degree.
You don't get to choose what's true. It's true or false. You want to discover it. We discover truth. We don't choose it.
Well, I choose to believe that you just have garbage comprehension skills rather than that you are a liar. My choosing to believe that doesn't make it true. Sure, you could be a liar, but that was still a belief that I chose. I guess you can sometimes choose your beliefs. But that said, evidence could change my mind here, and if I saw sufficient evidence, it would, whether I wanted it to or not. So the choice of belief is still not 100% mine.
And that's why I'm a Christian, and why I'm not a progressive Christian.
I hate gay people because I don't choose what's true. Isn't that funny? Gross, Mike. Especially considering the fact that the main cause of poor mental health outcomes among LGBTQ people is social stigma. As in, people like you laughing at how you're not a progressive Christian because you believe that being gay or trans is a sin. There is ample evidence that sexual orientation and gender identity both have biological causes. They are complex issues, so there's no gay or trans gene, but interaction of various genetic components, along with epigenetic factors like hormone exposure, largely program your sexual orientation and gender identity before you are even born. So it is a biological fact of reality that LGBTQ people exist. It is also a fact of reality that attempts to change gender identity or sexual orientation, that is, conversion therapy, are abject failures that result in poor mental health outcomes, including a significant increase in the risk of suicide attempts. In fact, conversion therapy outcomes are so terrible that it violates Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims issued a report documenting the fact that conversion therapy amounts to torture. These are facts about reality, supported by mountains of data, and yet you continue to consider just existing as an LGBTQ person to be a sin. Sure, you'll couch it in terms that make it sound like you're not specifically targeting them by saying things like, we're all sinful and wicked, but in order to hold the position that you do, you either have to deny reality, choosing to believe something that is demonstrably not true, or believe that God is the kind of cruel monster who would make someone LGBTQ and then condemn them to an eternity of torture for being exactly what he made them.
Friedrich Nietzsche has a argument as well that the article provides. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was a German philosopher, the article says, cultural critic, poet, philologist, and I don't remember what a philologist is.
It's someone who studies the history of languages.
Is that like a philosopher? I mean, the study of philo could be love, philosophy, wisdom. I don't know.
Philo, love. Logos, words. Love of words. It was also used in ancient Greek literature as a jab at people who were overly verbose. You know, the kinds of people who would add unnecessary adverbs like overly to words that already adequately encapsulated what they were trying to say, like verbose.
And Latin and Greek scholar whose work has exerted a profound influence on Western philosophy and modern intellectual history. And here's a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. I have not come to know atheism as a result of logical reasoning. Remember this, guys. I have not come to know atheism as a result of logical reasoning, and still less as an event of my life. So it's not experience and it's not reason. In me, it is a matter of instinct.
Yeah, that's not the greatest quote that they could have used to make the point that they're trying to make with it. Worth mentioning here is that it was from a chapter in a book that Nietzsche wrote called, in English, Why I'm So Smart. The work as a whole is known as a self-celebrating and self-mocking autobiographical work. Now, let's put that quote in a bit of context and see if we can't make a bit more sense out of it. And I'd just like to note that this was originally written in German, and the English translation that I found is a bit different from that one, so that's why it doesn't quite match up. Quote, God, immortality of the soul, redemption, beyond, all are terms that I paid no attention to, nor paid any time to, even as a child. Perhaps I was never childish enough for them. I don't know atheism at all as a result, still less as an event. I understand it by instinct. I'm too curious, too questionable, and too high-spirited to put up with a blunt answer. God is a rude answer, an indelicacy against us thinkers. Basically, even just a rude ban on us. You shouldn't think. I feel like the bit about logical reasoning was added in by someone who wanted to make the same point in a more concise, quotable way. I did pop through a few different translations and most omit that part, but there was one that included it. After playing with the original German and Google Translate, I see no hint that the words logical reasoning should be there, though I also don't speak German, so I could very well be wrong. The point he seems to have been making here is that he doesn't know atheism as a result of the examination of claims about ethereal, unfalsifiable things like God, the soul, the afterlife, etc., nor is he an atheist because of the Christian movie trope of a dead cancer mom, not specifically an example that he used, obviously, but I feel like he would appreciate the comparison at least a little. But rather, he is an atheist because answering a question with God puts a halt to figuring out what the real answer is. Instinct, in this sense, is not him saying that atheism is an instinctive part of being human. Rather, his instinct led him to be too curious to be satisfied with God as an answer to a question.
Now, this is considered an argument now for atheism, and here's the argument. Atheism is instinctual. You are naturally atheists, and so, therefore, you should stay an atheist, because it's a natural thing.
Well, that does seem to be the main thrust of the argument as this particular blogger is using it, but the real argument, if you actually look at the context of the quote, is that answering a question with God blocks further thinking and development of ideas on whatever subject the question is about. And it's important to keep in mind the self-deprecating nature of this particular work. If something seems to be exaggerated to the point of ridiculousness, it was probably done so intentionally. This is just a paragraph away, after all, from where he says that the German spirit of the old barbaric Germans was a result of indigestion from eating soup as an appetizer, boiled meats, and vegetables that were made fat and mealy. Now, in context, this was a metaphor about the quality of philosophers that he had read in his youth, but it's written in an overblown way. And as a side note, in the same metaphor he refers to English cuisine as a return to nature, that is, cannibalism. I'm actually quite enjoying this book.
Let's read it. Atheism is completely natural. A primary tool of critical thought is to remember that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Bottom rung atheism, guys.
I like how he says that as though his saying that completely negates any point being made. And yes, it is a pithy quip that could do with more fleshing out, but if you actually take a moment to look into its meaning and origin, you'll find that that iteration of the quote came from Carl Sagan. Important to note here is that Sagan explicitly rejected the atheist label. So to call a Sagan quote bottom-rung atheism suggests that Mike might just be engaging in bottom-rung apologetics. But the astute among you might have noticed my use of the words that iteration of the quote. That's because Sagan didn't invent that principle. He was rephrasing a statement of Pierre-Simon Laplace, an 18th and 19th century French polymath whose work laid the groundwork for several fields of science, everything from engineering and math to physics, astronomy, and philosophy. The original quote was in French, but the English translation of it is, "The weight of evidence for an extraordinary claim must be proportioned to its strangeness." But that's still not really the origin. This concept has been around for long enough that its actual origin remains uncertain. Similar statements have been recorded as far back as the early 1700s, seeming to originate with the Anglican vicar Benjamin Bailey, who said, "These matters being very extraordinary will require a very extraordinary proof" in 1708. So your bottom-rung atheist argument actually originated with a vicar of the Anglican Church. Another religious official, and one who I actually brought up a couple weeks ago, the abolitionist Anglican Bishop Belby Porteous, gave a variation of this quote, saying, "Miracles being very unusual and extraordinary facts, they require very strong evidence to support them." Philosopher David Hume is largely credited with being the first person to fully flesh out the concept as more than just a one-off statement. Do you consider Hume to be bottom-rung atheism? Or an Anglican bishop? And really, in looking into the number of people who have said this or something similar, it's mostly religious figures arguing against people claiming to have had direct revelation from God about the end times or something else of a prophetic nature. But modern apologists all seem to have a hard time with this. To quote Pelagia, "Poetry must give way to pragmatism in order that theists can understand our meaning." He then rephrases it as, "Claims of things I do not perceive as usual require evidence that has sufficient claim-affirming properties to overcome my pre-evidential assessment in order for me to personally become convinced of said claim." This is a true statement about how people become convinced of claims, regardless of the nature of those claims. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with religion. In fact, the Sagan version of the quote was about the claim that extraterrestrials have been visiting Earth. I feel like Winger would agree that there is not sufficiently extraordinary evidence to support such a claim. So why does he scoff at the idea that non-Christians would use a similar metric in examining religious claims?
When someone tells you that they saw a velociraptor in the forest, you're going to need evidence to believe them. I agree. Their claim is pretty extraordinary, so you would require some outstanding evidence for their claim. Well, I don't even know what outstanding means. I would require evidence for their claim.
Well, in the context of this quote, you would need evidence that sufficiently points exclusively to the conclusion that there is a velociraptor in the forest in order to convince you. And remember, this is subjectively about convincing you, because evidence could be something like a fresh velociraptor footprint. But if you're not an expert in identifying dinosaur footprints, then such evidence is not likely going to be sufficient to convince you because you look at the footprint and you don't know what it is. And even if you could verify that it looks like a velociraptor footprint, that evidence does not point exclusively to the conclusion that a velociraptor is currently alive in the forest. It could also point to someone having faked the footprints, or the footprints having been misidentified. A picture might be better evidence, but pictures can be faked, so it still doesn't exclusively point to that conclusion. In that instance, it's likely that seeing it for yourself will be the main piece of evidence that sufficiently points exclusively to that conclusion that it will be able to convince you. Now, there's nothing inherently extraordinary about seeing an animal in the forest. That's a rather mundane claim. The thing that makes it extraordinary is its relation to you. Seeing that animal specifically is not mundane, because it's believed with as much certainty as is possible in science to be extinct. And remember, this whole thing is in relation to having a goal of convincing someone of your claim. If the person who told you about the raptor in the woods didn't care whether or not you believe them, then they are not required to provide any evidence. So yeah, if you don't care whether or not I convert to Christianity, then you can claim whatever the hell you want about Christianity without providing a single lick of evidence. But if you actually want to convince me, then you need to bring evidence to the table that is sufficient to do so. And this is, unfortunately, a subjective metric. It will be different for each person. Someone who already believes that a God exists will have a lower threshold for believing the claim that this God raised his son from the dead than someone who does not believe that any God exists.
Religion is treated the exact same way. If a Muslim man tries to convert you to Islam, you're going to need some evidence for his claims about the truth of his religion. Yeah, I agree.
So far, he's just been agreeing with everything. Like, he called it bottom-rung atheism, but then he went on and agreed with it.
That's an important point about religion, that the burden of proof is on them to prove their fanciful ideas. Well, that's also true, but it's also true of atheism.
Atheism doesn't really have fanciful ideas. It's the answer to one single question. Do you believe that a god or gods exist? If the answer is no, then congratulations, you're an atheist. Now, there are implications of such an answer, and those can be examined in great philosophical detail, and there are philosophers who do just that, But trying to reverse the burden of proof by saying that atheists need to prove that there is no God is mainly a distraction from the fact that apologists don't seem to be confident that they have met their burden of proof. Also, for the record, I have defended the positive position that no God exists, with my definition of God being the God of the Bible, and that's actually kind of the crux of the problem of treating atheism as a positive claim. There are as many definitions of God as there are people who believe in God. It is functionally impossible to disprove all of them, because in order to do so, one would have to sit down and get every person who believes in God to lay out a specific enough definition of the God that they believe in order to figure out what it would take to falsify their specific God.
I believed in Christianity for a long time, and when I had the strongest doubts, now we're getting a mind inside the mind of Sam as he was going through his doubts. When he had those strongest doubts, here's what he would do. He would remember that his parents, friends, fellow churchgoers, and extended family wouldn't lie to me, he says, about something so important.
Yeah, I can sort of relate to that. You have a strong doubt, and when there doesn't seem to be any way to make sense of your doubts, you reassure yourself with the idea that either loved ones who taught you that religion is true wouldn't lie, or the idea that there are people out there who have done the investigative legwork and have learned that Christianity is true. So maybe I haven't personally found the compelling evidence yet, but other people have, so surely it's out there. And then when such a person investigates it for themselves, if they don't find the evidence to be all that compelling, then they're not likely to continue believing.
Atheism is instinctual, but so is trust, which makes his entire argument self-refuting. We'll come back to that in a second. One is that atheism itself is like an instinctual natural thing, and the implication, he doesn't say it, the implication is that we should believe whatever comes naturally.
Despite what I said earlier, I don't think that actually is the implication. And I'd also disagree that atheism comes naturally. In fact, as an atheist, I just have to look at the fact that most societies throughout most of history have had very strong beliefs about gods, which would then force me to conclude that theism is natural. There's even evolutionary explanations for how belief in the supernatural could have naturally evolved. For instance, the tiger in the grass example, where there would have been a selection pressure in our ancestors to attribute agency to things. If the grass moves and you believe it's just the wind, but it's actually a tiger stalking you, you're more likely to die when the tiger attacks you than if you think it might be something dangerous, so prepare yourself to deal with the danger. So to think that there is an agent causing things to happen will increase your chance of survival, and being wrong about there being an agent doesn't have negative impact. So over time, people who have a tendency to attribute agency to events that aren't necessarily caused by agents are more likely to survive and reproduce. And we know that our brains are wired to see agency where there is none, and that people who believe in God are more likely to attribute agency where there is none. So while this isn't an hypothesis that is strong enough to be considered the consensus viewpoint, it's also not a fringe idea. So yeah, as annoying as it is, a belief in God does appear to be closer to what one might call natural. But as you so astutely point out, something being a natural inclination for us to believe does not make it true or worth believing.
Notice the double standard. Atheism is supposed to be believed without reason or evidence.
No, atheism is just the rejection of a claim. You say God exists. I say, I don't believe you. If you wish to convince me, you need to bring evidence to the table. You respond, morality proves that we get our morals from God. And I remain unconvinced because morality varies so greatly between individuals and cultures, and that would not be the case if there was an all-powerful source of absolute morality. I don't need to give you evidence to support the position of atheism, I just need to remain unconvinced of theism. Now sure, a case could be made for how, in philosophical circles, atheism is more likely to come as a positive position that makes the claim that there is no God, and this would, in a formal debate setting, come with the burden of proof. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about you, a Christian, wanting to save souls by convincing people of the truth of Christianity. Most atheists aren't concerned about convincing other people of the truth of atheism, so whether or not atheism technically comes with a burden of proof when speaking philosophically is irrelevant. At the end of the day, you want to convince them of the truth of your proposition, while they don't care one whit about convincing you of the truth of atheism. Now, it can be easy to lose track of this when spending time in atheist or apologetics online spaces, but those of us who are vocal about these things are in the minority. And even in these weird atheist online spaces, in my experience, the majority of atheists who are vocal in these spaces aren't actually all that concerned with convincing Christians to become atheists. It's more about convincing Christians to mind their own damn business.
That's argument number 3. Yet, we should only believe in God if we have, quote, extraordinary evidence.
Yes. Or rather, evidence that has sufficient claim-affirming properties to overcome my pre-evidential assessment in order for me personally to become convinced of said claim. It would be helpful here if you could, actually define the terms that you're using rather than relying on people's colloquial understanding.
Okay, stop for a minute. This is like religious brainwashing to the max.
How so? I'll believe something when you provide enough evidence to convince me of that thing. And that makes me brainwashed somehow?
You should believe atheism with no evidence and without logical reasoning.
No, you should reject theism until they provide evidence. Say agnostic if that makes you feel more comfortable, but ultimately, unless you're engaged in a discussion in an academic setting, such as a formal debate, then the rejection of theism is not itself a claim, it's just not being convinced of a claim.
But you should only believe religion if you have extraordinary evidence, whatever that is.
Well, I've told you what that is, and if you weren't stuck on the bottom rung of apologetics, you might have done some reading into the philosophical history of that phrase and figured out what it means for yourself, instead of flailing around helplessly trying to word game your way out of having to support your position, while having the expectation that other people are going to be convinced by your position.
So is atheism instinctual? Probably not. But what if we held that standard consistently and we said, you should only believe what comes natural?
And who set that standard? It's certainly not being proposed by the author of the article you're reading. I'll agree that it's not a terribly well-written article, but at no point does he say that we should only believe what comes naturally.
Well, we're going to believe all kinds of, it's not that we're going to believe all kinds of weird things. It's that we're going to lose all kinds of important and true things that we do believe now. If we hold that, we believe what's instinctual, right? Whatever doesn't have to be trained, that's what I should believe.
And now you're adding a weird definition of natural onto your assumption that they were saying that you should only believe what is natural. Training is a part of nature. It's basically just learning through feedback.
I think that the current growth of atheism, the spike in growth of atheism that has happened recently, is due to the promulgation of atheism in our universities as well as online.
Yeah, as it turns out, when you expose people to ideas that conflict with your religion, then if your religion can't stand on its own merits, you wind up with more people leaving that religion. Funny how that works.
Finally, let's come to the second issue. Does belief in God require extraordinary evidence? And again, I have a whole video on this with more detail, but let me just say the short answer is no.
You just finished saying that you didn't know what is meant by extraordinary evidence. How can you definitively say that belief in Christianity does not take extraordinary evidence if you don't even know what extraordinary evidence is?
And the reason is because you don't know what you mean by extraordinary evidence.
I know what I mean. Evidence that sufficiently points exclusively to the conclusion of Christianity in order to convince me. Now, the specifics of exactly what sort of hypothetical evidence might meet that level of extraordinariness aren't exactly nailed down quite as well as Jesus on Passover weekend, but if you want to convince me, then you need to present me with the evidence so that I can then evaluate it for myself in order to see if I find it to be convincing. Complaining about definitions isn't going to accomplish that, and if you weren't a bottom-rung apologist, you might have been able to figure those definitions out by now so that such complaints would be unnecessary in the first place.
If, hypothetically, Jesus existed 2,000 years ago, died on the cross, was buried in a tomb, rose from the dead, and he was physically alive. Let's pretend that happened historically. What kind of evidence, hypothetically, would you look back and expect to find? That's a huge key here that they always ignore. Expect to find when you look at the historical record. What sorts of evidence would you expect to find if it was true?
No, we don't ignore that. And there are a few more details that impact what kind of evidence we'd expect to find that Mike's leaving out here. Because if this Jesus guy was just some dude and neither he nor anyone else really cared about convincing future people of his resurrection, then you'd expect to find pretty much what we have. No eyewitness testimony, stories written decades later by people who weren't there, no official records from the Romans, passing mentions about the beliefs of this guy's followers by a couple of historians writing, again, several decades after the fact at the least. You know, just generally the kind of stuff that would also be expected if he didn't actually come back from the dead, but some people from the time thought that he did. But if this Jesus guy is actually an omnipotent God who wants everyone to believe that he is God, and that he did come back from the dead, then we'd expect that God to, at a minimum, provide personal revelation of the basic facts of the religion to everyone himself, without relying on the imperfect jumbled mess of the Bible. We'd expect that the religion that worships him would be completely unified in message, because such a God wouldn't want such a message to become polluted by the ideas and mistakes of mere mortals. We'd expect Christians to have the healing powers that Jesus said they'd have. We'd expect that apologists wouldn't have to exist to explain why none of the expectations that we would have if Christianity were true are actually true. We would expect that a book that is the word of such a God would be completely incorruptible, not just inerrant, but impossible for errors to be introduced through the copying and translation process. And since the book that is the word of this God is perfect and incorruptible, we'd expect that supplementary books written by fallible humans would not be necessary to explain this perfect and incorruptible perfect message from God. That's just a small list of many pieces of evidence that we would expect to find if Christianity were actually true.
And that's the problem with the extraordinary evidence claim. It's always irrational.
In order to judge whether or not it's rational, you'd have to first know what is meant by extraordinary evidence, which you have conceded that you do not.
Let's apply it to the velociraptor scenario. He says, if you saw a velociraptor, I would need outstanding evidence, he says. Well, I just need evidence, okay? Look, if you have video footage and I have reason to think it's not been tampered with.
And what about that would not be extraordinary? Hypothetically excluding the idea that such a video could be faked, how exactly is authentic video footage of a velociraptor walking in a modern forest not extraordinary?
And why do I expect video footage, for the raptor, but not for Jesus? Because there were no video cameras. Like, you don't expect video footage where there are no video cameras.
Who asked for video footage anyway? I'm asking for no more than the Bible promises, a personal experience with God himself. The Bible says that this is something that you can expect if you sincerely seek it. When I was a Christian, I did sincerely seek it, and I was left hanging. But I mean, that aside, does the Bible not also say that all things are possible through God? Does all things not include somehow providing video footage of an important event? Why is that just dismissed as an obviously ridiculous expectation when it is, in fact, something that God could very easily do?
This is kind of like thinking 101, right? Just normal thinking here.
Thinking 101 according to Mike Winger. All things are possible through God, but video cameras in the first century are not a part of all things. The fact that human technology advances as humans make discoveries independent of any divine revelation is not exactly a great point in favor of the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing God who loves human beings. You think he could have tipped the ancient Israelites off about germs at the very least.
But I have video evidence, or you could show me bones from the raptor, DNA that shows that it's fresh.
Again, that would be extraordinary evidence. Not because the existence of fresh bones or DNA is inherently extraordinary, but because they would be fresh bones or DNA that belong to a species that went extinct tens of millions of years ago. But also, such evidence, as mundane as it is, would have a number of hurdles to overcome. The overcoming of these hurdles is part of what makes it extraordinary. Because, for starters, we haven't sequenced the velociraptor genome, so how is it determined that this fresh DNA was actually velociraptor DNA and not contamination from a modern organism? Were the bones confirmed to actually be velociraptor bones and not bones that were misidentified from some other species? Have these findings been replicated? This actually reminds me of a tangent I went on when responding to Matt Powell. He brought up a triceratops horn that had an inordinately large amount of soft tissue in it, and claimed that the configuration of the tissue confirmed that it had drowned. The amount of soft tissue claimed to have been found was extraordinary, and if the finding had been genuine, this could have been a fairly earth-shattering paleontological discovery. But the discoverer of that fossil, Mark Armitage, notably not a paleontologist, would not allow other paleontologists to examine the find, only providing one picture of the fossil in situ, and that picture was partially obstructed. The fossil was broken apart in transit, and no pictures of the pieces positioned in a way that made it obvious how it had broken and that they were all pieces from the same fossil were ever provided. And bison horns are frequently misidentified as triceratops horns. In this case, extraordinary evidence would mostly just be the exact same level of evidence that would be required to support conclusions of any fossil find. Identification by a relevant expert, examination by researchers from other institutions, rigorous documentation of the fossil in situ during transport and at the facility, replication of the findings of soft tissues, etc. All of that is pretty normal for a fossil to go through. But if the results that Armitage found were legit, then in light of the rest of the body of scientific knowledge about fossils and which animals existed when, then all the normal things that a fossil goes through when coming up with those results would be extraordinary evidence despite their mundane nature.
You could bring other eyewitnesses who have no apparent reason to lie about it.
Yeah, no. No matter how adamant an eyewitness is about seeing a velociraptor in the woods, eyewitness testimony is some of the lowest quality evidence there is, even in the best of circumstances. It has proved to be relatively easy for researchers to provide cues that will alter subjects' memories, and in some cases create entirely new memories out of whole cloth. Add that to the fact that our senses are often unreliable, and we wind up with evidence that is subject to alteration that is undetectable to us, and based on potentially flawed observations to begin with. Even if I saw the velociraptor for myself, it would be more likely that I am hallucinating than that it actually is a velociraptor. If I was looking at it for myself, I'd still need confirmation that the others around me could see it as well, preferably something in the form of physical evidence.
And seem to be confirming with slightly varied accounts of the same event to show that they're actually giving their own account.
Okay, but what if the variations in the story are mutually exclusive? And actually, you're pretty obviously trying to equate this with the gospel accounts about Jesus, so let's make it line up a bit closer here. You aren't talking to an eyewitness, you're talking to someone who heard that someone else saw the raptor, at best. In reality, with the Gospels, it's a few more times removed than that, but let's just give it to them for argument's sake. So someone tells you that someone told them that they saw a velociraptor in the woods. Then you heard from another person that someone told them that they saw a velociraptor in the woods. And their accounts are different, which indicates that they didn't corroborate, so these must be independent accounts, right? Well, not quite. You see, if we're trying to keep this analogous, not only are these not eyewitness accounts, they are word-for-word copies of each other throughout a good chunk of the story. And since the Gospels were originally written in Greek, but the people that they are about would have spoken Aramaic, then these word-for-word copies are also translations. And remember how earlier we had the issue where different translations of Nietzsche's work ended up being worded differently? If the different sources for his book were identical, we would expect that they were all based on the same translation. The fact that they were different is what shows us that it was different people doing the translating. But for the Gospels, there are quotes of people talking where, if it was an actual event, the people would have been speaking Aramaic. But in the translation to Greek, the Gospel authors all wrote it down identically. So back to our analogy, the multiple people who spoke to supposed witnesses are telling you what they saw in English, but the witnesses told them in Spanish. And they all say the exact same thing for most of the account. And then when it differs in ways that are incompatible. One says that at exactly 3 p.m. he saw the raptor eat a cow. Another says that at exactly 3 p.m. he saw the raptor chasing a police squad car through the forest. Assuming there is only one raptor in this scenario, it is not possible for them both to be correct. It is, however, quite possible that they are both incorrect, especially given the weakness of all the other evidence.
Back in the day, we have textual evidence for Jesus.
I'll grant for argument's sake that the textual evidence is enough to get you to the existence of a guy that the Jesus stories are based on, but it doesn't go any further than that.
We have archaeological evidence.
What kind of archaeological evidence? The best I've seen for archaeological evidence related to Jesus is that some of the places that were described in the Gospels have potentially been found, like Bethsaida. But the best that gets us is that the people who told the stories about Jesus were at least familiar with some of the places where Jesus was supposed to have gone. That says nothing about whether or not the things that Jesus was supposed to have done there actually happened. Now, I know that Mike will call this a bottom-rung atheist argument and dismiss it, but that is the equivalent of saying that the existence of New York City is evidence for Spider-Man. And not just Spider-Man's existence, but the existence of a godlike being known as the Beyonder who once started a cult called the Cosmic Oneness. Of course, the main problem with this comparison is that we know that the authors of the Spider-Man comics were writing fiction, and that's true, but the level of evidence remains the same nonetheless. For all we know, the Gospel authors were writing fiction. There is still scholarly debate as to what genre the Gospels even are, or whether they constitute a new genre that hadn't existed prior to their writing. Can we say for certain that they weren't intentionally writing fiction, when we can't even conclusively say what genre they were writing? There are aspects of Greco-Roman biography in the Gospels, but if we consider it to be that type of biography, we are then left with the problem that a Greco-Roman style biography was more concerned with displaying the main figure's core character traits, and if a story had to be just made up in order to do that, then that was fine. So if they're biographies in that sense, then they might be true in the sense that they accurately represent the character traits of Jesus, but the details are not necessarily true. There are also aspects of traditional Jewish storytelling, with motifs surrounding God's acts of redemption towards his people, culminating in the greatest act that was the coming of the Messiah. But one of the things about motifs in a story is that they tend to indicate fiction, so again, we're left with the idea that even if there was a core historical element to the story, the motifs were written around this core element in a way that makes it almost certain that they are not true stories. And really, regardless of genre, there are stories that we know for a fact were not written until well after the Gospels were written. The story of the woman caught in adultery, for instance, that doesn't show up in any manuscript before the 5th century. It was likely written sometime before that, in the late 2nd to early 3rd century, but this is still about a century after the Book of John was written. The language used is very out of place for John and would have fit better in one of the synoptic Gospels. In fact, some of the ancient scribes that were copying out these manuscripts agreed. There are some manuscripts where the story is instead put in the Book of Luke. So, did this story actually happen? Almost certainly not. It is so far removed from the time of the events, and it's so out of place, that it seems likely that there isn't even an historical core to this particular story. So all this to say that archaeological discoveries have confirmed that some of the people and places named in the Gospels were real, and rather than this being extraordinary evidence to support the claim that the Gospels are actually literally true, it's actually quite mundane. If the Gospels were literally true, then them being accurate about people and places would be a bare minimum expectation, as even the authors of fiction can get some details right.
We have eyewitness evidence.
No, the fuck we do not. There is a grand total of one author of any of the New Testament books who claims to have seen Jesus for himself, and that is Paul, who didn't meet Jesus until after the resurrection, and who describes the experience in a way that makes it abundantly clear that it was a vision rather than a physical interaction. The Gospels are not written by eyewitnesses. They don't even pretend to be. Luke even pretty explicitly states at the beginning of his book that he is not an eyewitness, but is compiling the story from multiple sources. Now, he does claim to be working from eyewitness accounts himself, but he never names his sources, and he heavily copied word for word from the Book of Mark, which not even church tradition tries to claim is an eyewitness account. At no point do we have anyone other than Paul even claim to have been an eyewitness to anything, and what Paul claims to have witnessed isn't a whole lot.
And we have good historical and critical research that goes and brings it all back to the first century, to the time of Christ. You just need normal evidence to prove any claim.
Okay, but that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Your normal evidence is maybe enough to get you to the possibility that the stories of Jesus in the Bible were based on a real guy, and that's it. Even then, it's rather weak. Even if the Gospels were based on eyewitness testimony, the earliest was written some 40 years after Jesus would have died. Are you willing to claim that these books would have been completely accurate stories of what actually happened, right down to word-for-word quotes of people in conversations, including conversations that the eyewitnesses couldn't possibly have witnessed? You know, like when Jesus was alone with Pilate. Just given how human memory works, it's basically impossible that books written 40 years later would have the degree of accuracy required to be called inerrant. Now, sure, you can appeal to God doing miracles to make sure they were inerrant, but this leaves us with two problems. First, it's really weird that he would perform such miracles to make sure the original documents were inerrant, and then would stop to allow errors to creep in as new copies were being made, and allow us to lose the originals altogether. Second, this would be another claim for which you would need to bring supporting evidence to the table, and I can't even think of what kind of evidence would actually support such a claim. So if I'm extremely generous with my assessment of the evidence, we have enough to support the idea that a religious leader named Jesus, well, actually Yeshua, and I'm rather fond of that joke about how Yeshua would have been better translated as Joshua, and that Christ means anointed one, and since anointing something is to rub it with oil, then his name in English is Oily Josh. So we have enough evidence to suggest that Oily Josh built up enough of a following to wind up on Rome's radar, Roman authorities had him executed, and some of his followers had experiences that they thought meant that Oily Josh had come back from the dead, hope the oil wasn't rancid, and managed to convince others of the same, leading to the beginnings of a new religion. And that's it. We don't get to a point where we are justified in believing in the truth of that religion, and we barely have any details about Oily Josh's life or ministry.
Normal evidence. It just has to be good evidence, decent evidence.
My God, Mike, how do you not see it? Normal evidence, it just has to be good evidence. In other words, it has to be evidence that has sufficient claim-affirming properties to overcome your pre-evidential assessment in order for you to personally become convinced of the claim. Extraordinary evidence. And also with the recognition that the quality of evidence required to overcome someone's pre-evidential assessment of the likelihood of a claim will be different for different people. Which should go without saying. If that weren't true, then I wouldn't have to make this video. Either I would still be a Christian because it met its burden of extraordinary evidence, or Mike would be an atheist because it had not.
And oddly enough, he contradicts himself by saying atheism is instinctual, therefore you should believe it. But he also says trust is instinctual, but he wants you to reject that because it's an inconsistent standard. Don't trust those people.
If I were to steelman this argument, I'd suggest that it's not saying that you should rely solely on your instincts when determining truth. Instead, it's pointing out that this dichotomy will lead to an internal conflict, where the stronger instinct, the trust of a child for the authority figures in their lives, will likely win. At no point in this article does he say that you should be an atheist because it is instinctual. He's just saying that it is, in fact, instinctual. If I had to guess, I'd actually say that they probably were writing this partly as a response to the claim that apologists often make, that humans have a natural inclination to believe in the supernatural, as nearly every culture that we are aware of on the planet has had religion or superstition in one form or another, which they claim is reason to believe that there's something to these inclinations to supernatural beliefs.
I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying the standard here is inconsistent. It's not right. So the straw man of Christianity in argument number 3, to conclude it, is that the only reason to be a Christian is because your parents, friends, and church say so. And by the way, my parents were not following Christ. My father was the first one to try to talk me out of my Christian faith.
While I don't think the point was very well made in the article, you're not exactly steel-manning the position. Yeah, sure, your dad may not have been Christian and tried to talk you out of your faith, but why did you become a Christian? Did you discover Christianity through reading the texts and then examining the evidence for yourself, and only once you found enough evidence did you start believing in it? Did you receive direct revelation from God himself? Or were you maybe told about it by someone else, a friend, a pastor, a relative? Christianity seems to spread mostly, if not exclusively, through personal interaction. It doesn't spread academically. In fact, there are plenty of hardcore evangelical Christians out there that don't particularly care for the academic work surrounding Christianity, being resistant to conclusions that they don't like that the Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses, were written decades after the events they purport to describe, and that they were modified after the fact. Stuff like that. These are conclusions that have been reached by scholars who are mostly Christians themselves, working for Christian institutions. But these literal-minded evangelicals reject their conclusions, often painting these conclusions as lies meant to cause people to question their beliefs. So no, Christianity doesn't seem to spread academically. Neither does it spread through personal revelation. Never once in history has any group of people developed the religion of Christianity prior to the arrival of Christians. If God is personally revealing himself to everyone in a way that would cause them to become Christian if they weren't denying the truth in their unrighteousness, then the expectation would be that nearly every culture would develop Christianity independently. But the exact opposite is true. And this leaves personal interaction. You likely became a Christian because of a personal interaction that you had, probably with someone you trust, and it was probably an emotional experience rather than a data-driven one.
Number 4, let's look at argument number 4. The quote from Friedrich Nietzsche is, Christianity was from the beginning, essentially and fundamentally, life's nausea and disgust with life, merely concealed behind, masked by, and dressed up as faith in another or better life. Now, to the informed Christian, you immediately recognize this quote as being pure mockery that is utterly baseless.
So, fun fact, before hearing what Mike had to say about this quote, I spent a bunch of time reading the original work, reading essays written about it, trying to understand it, what it meant in context, how it related to the rest of the book that it's found in, which is an examination of ancient Greek dramatic styles, contrasting the Dionysian to the Apollonian, and doesn't really have much to do with Christianity at all. In context, it's contained in a foreword that was written when the book was reprinted, and was part of a small discussion comparing Christianity to art and pointing out that the obsession with truth grounded in God essentially relegates all art to being a mere falsehood. But then I remembered who I'm responding to here, and I figured I might have been putting in too much effort at this point, so I listened to hear what Mike had to say. And yeah, that was a bunch of wasted time. Instead of putting in all that effort to actually understand what Nietzsche was saying here, I could simply have pointed out that Henri de Lubac, one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century, referred to it as a work of genius. A highly respected Christian theologian thought that this work of Nietzsche's was a work of genius, and there has been philosophical study and debate about this work for over a century now. But you know what? No worries, guys. Mike Winger is here to tell us that informed Christians can just dismiss it as being pure mockery that is utterly baseless.
But if you are a pop atheist, you think that's exactly what it is.
You know, my general distaste for philosophical argumentation has occasionally left me feeling inadequate. Like, maybe in all that technobabble sounding jargon, even after I think I've parsed it out, I might still be missing something. I find myself constantly re-examining philosophical discussions and arguments that I've examined a bazillion times before, wondering if maybe this time something new will click in my brain, allowing me to see it in a new light and have a better understanding, but with the constant fear that there will always be something that I missed. I am now finding myself jealous of the confident ignorance that Mike constantly displays, where even a cursory examination of the words being said irrespective of context is apparently unnecessary. Like, just read those words and then think what they might mean. Christianity is life's disgust with life, concealed behind faith in another or better life. On its face, ignoring the context, what that appears to be talking about is how Christians are encouraged to not worry about this life, but instead concern themselves with making sure they get into the good afterlife, because it'll be so much better. And that is not pure mockery that is utterly baseless. That's a pretty close paraphrase of the words of Jesus Christ himself in Matthew 6:19-21, where he said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So unless you, for some reason, think that the words of Jesus Christ are just a baseless mockery of Christianity, then I think this quote deserves a more serious treatment from you.
I'm to speak pastorally here. Those who are prone towards bitterness, towards leaders, towards other people in their lives, they will be drawn to this kind of argumentation. It just fits their mentalities.
Also great theologians, but at this point I think it's pretty well established that that's a category that does not contain Mike here.
However, if we can be united in our dissociation from real life, we can be happy. We can call this dissociation faith. I'm always enamored by the weird definitions of faith that atheists will offer.
Well, the definition that I'm partial to is the one that's found in the Bible in the book of Hebrews. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen.
Ignoring, actual linguistics, use in Greek and Hebrew in the Bible, or in actual careful, thoughtful Christian theology, faith is just trust, right? It's a choice to trust.
Here's the thing, though. Faith and trust do have two different meanings in modern English, and the scholars and linguists who translate the Bible know that. So if faith just meant trust, then they wouldn't have translated it as faith. They would have translated it as trust. So I am going to trust that the experts who translated it as faith had good reason for doing so. Actually, scratch that. Why should I bother putting effort into understanding the nuance and intricacies of the Bible, the translation process, the etymology of the various important words in multiple languages, etc., when you can't even be arsed to Google a single quote from a dissenting voice to make sure you properly understood its context before dismissing it as baseless mockery? I've already put more effort into this one video than you have in the 50 minutes of your video so far. And yes, that is how far into Mike's video we are at this point. It was a long one where he said almost nothing.
The reality is, all we have is each other, connection, and this life. Anything more is hopeful delusions. I'm going to argue that this isn't even something you have on atheism.
You're going to argue that the connections we make with people in the one life that we know for sure we have is something that we don't actually have? I'm curious to see where that'll end up.
I've also noticed that this painful truth about religion is made up of people who are intensely afraid of reality and of the truth of the human condition. Now, I asked you guys to notice that phrase there, that it assumes that atheism is true in order to prove that it's true. This is the absolute best example of circular reasoning.
Well, if I were to steelman the argument, it seems to be getting at the fact that Christians don't behave as though they believe that Christianity is true. And I don't mean some Christians end up being hypocrites who don't practice what they preach. I'm talking about how, when the chips are down, when dealing with things like grief and loss, Christians act the same as atheists do. When a Christian loses a loved one, for the most part, they grieve just as intensely as an atheist. This should not be the case. If Christianity were true, you might be a bit sad that you won't get to see your loved one again for a while, but it wouldn't be grief at the same intensity as an atheist who knows that the loved one is gone forever. It'd be more like if the loved one just moved to a different country. Sure, you'll miss them, but you'll see them again eventually. It's not goodbye forever. Like, remember how the Christian response to non-Christians bringing up the fact that God kills a lot of people is to say something like, if Christianity is true, people don't die, they just change location?
If Christianity's true, people don't die, they just change location.
Well, if y'all actually believed that, you wouldn't be any sadder about the loss of a loved one than you would if that same person just moved away. So to say that religion is made up of people who are intensely afraid of reality is essentially to say that, rather than face the truth of something like the loss of a loved one, the religious retreat into the belief that it's only temporary, while knowing deep down that it's not true. It's kind of like a Romans 1:20 reversal thing. You know in your heart that Christianity isn't true, you just deny that truth in your desire to not be sad when someone you love dies. But you end up being sad anyway because you really know that it's not true. I don't entirely agree with this line of argumentation, but there is more to it than Mike is letting on. Shocker, I know. We should totally expect an apologist of the everyone knows that God is real because the Bible says so variety to put more effort into understanding what a circular argument really is here.
This connects to the idea that is carried through the rest of the passage, that people know there's a God. The truth of God is just obvious through creation. It's obvious that there's a God. And to hold back or resist this, it requires you to push against this truth. to suppress it. You Christians, you know how I know you're wrong? Because you are desperately denying the truth of atheism. That's how I know.
My God, he's even using the exact same language as the Bible when saying that it's circular. How does he not see it?
And actually, Christianity, unlike, say, New Age beliefs or the beliefs that we're all divinity and we're just sort of discovering our, like Christian Science type stuff, that type of thing is very different than Christianity. Christianity is a sober view of the human condition, right? Because all religions aren't the same.
Is Christianity a sober view of humanity, or is it just a degrading one? I can have a sober view, recognizing that nobody is perfect and everyone has done some shitty things in their lives, but Christianity takes that to the extreme and says that because you have done some shitty things in your life, it doesn't matter how much good you did, it can never make up for it, you deserve to be tortured for eternity. I might not agree with other religions either, but there are few that have as demeaning a view of humanity as Christianity does, which I guess Mike sees as an argument in favor of Christianity for some reason.
Christianity says you are sinful, you are fallen, and you have judgment coming upon you because of your wickedness.
Yeah, see, there it is. We're all horrid, wicked people who deserve eternal torture. I thought about a butt once, so obviously that means I need to be spanked forever. Spank me, daddy.
But it also teaches that humans are made in God's image and that we have this incredible value and we have this incredible potential to know God and to love God and to love others. And we have this incredible, daunting responsibility before God one day for all those things.
Yeah, but no matter how good you get at any of that, you're still a horrible, wicked person deserving of hell, and you'd better prostrate yourself before God lest he inflict that torture upon you.
It teaches that God loves us, but there is only one way, Jesus. It's exclusive. This is not something people like. Even Christians will try to get around it sometimes to try to get away from the exclusivity of having faith in Christ, or the idea of hell.
Some Christians do try to get around that, yes, because they recognize how immoral it is to reward heinously immoral people like Jeffrey Dahmer with eternal paradise while sending good people who happen to just be non-Christian to hell. Their innate sense of morality that you would use to argue in favor of God's existence finds your God's system to be immoral, so they construct a better merit-based system.
Here's a question, though. How does atheism do the same thing? How does atheism handle the human condition and the reality of what's going on?
By looking it square in the eye and saying, yeah, some things about life suck, but this is the only life we get, so we should work together to make it as enjoyable as possible for as many people as possible. I don't give to charity in the hope that it'll earn me a bigger mansion in heaven one day. I give to charity because I can, and I recognize that my giving to charity will help people who are in need so that I can do a bit to make their lives just a little bit better.
Is it possible that atheism is actually afraid of reality and that atheists are denying the truth of the human condition?
It's possible, but so far, I've seen no good reason to think so.
I think it is, and I can give a case for it.
Go for it! I expect nothing but the highest tier evidence from bottom rung Mikey at this point.
In atheism, you don't have any real grounding for believing in moral values and duties. This has caused many atheists to deny the reality of moral values and duties.
So, your case that atheists are deluded in denying the human condition is entirely predicated on an argument from Consequences? You don't like the idea of a universe that doesn't contain inherent moral values and duties, so you conclude that this cannot be the case? I don't know, man. You're supposed to be convincing me that it's me denying reality, but if you believe in Christianity because you don't like the implications of atheism rather than because of an actual examination of the arguments and evidence, that seems like it's still you denying reality. And worth mentioning is that there are atheists who do believe that there are non-theistic justifications and groundings for objective moral values and duties. They do exist, but I am not one of them. In fact, I'm rather of the opinion that even if a God does exist, that does nothing to ground morality. Either morality is subjective, just with God as the subject instead of us, imposing his subjective morality on us through the might makes right system that is divine command theory, or morality is independent of God, making God nothing more than the communicator of morality at best, not the source.
And then play weird word games about subjective and objective.
The projection is strong with this one. Is it a weird word game to use those words to mean what we understand them to mean instead of having to wiggle out of their meaning by appealing to God's nature as somehow not being a part of God in the subjective sense, but still tied to God? Something is subjective if it's dependent on a subject. In your view, if God doesn't exist, then neither does morality. So morality is dependent on God as the subject. If morality were objective, then it would just be a fact about reality irrespective of the existence or non-existence of subjective beings.
But basically, it just causes them in that worldview to deny that those moral values and duties are real, that it's truly always wrong to torture a baby for fun.
Oh, hey, it's been a while since I've come across a clip that I can add to the torture babies for fun montage.
That we know that it's objectively wrong to torture infants for fun.
Every one of us knows that torturing an innocent baby for fun is wrong.
Do we understand that torturing babies for fun is really wrong?
That it's truly always wrong to torture a baby for fun.
The qualifier for fun is quite telling in this one. As an atheist, I am free to just say that torturing babies is wrong, no qualifiers necessary. But as a Christian, given that God has tortured babies to death in the Old Testament, you need the for fun qualifier in order to be able to condemn the torturing of babies, while still allowing for a situation where you can't say that it's wrong all the time, like when God killed a bunch of babies through drowning, one of the most painful ways to die, or the babies who get terminal illnesses and live short, pain-filled lives. As an atheist, I can look at such situations and declare them to be tragic without having to find a moral justification for a being actively inflicting them on people, because the expectation of a godless universe is that there is no higher power looking out for us, so sometimes horrendously painful things happen to even the most innocent among us. But as a Christian, at the very least, you have a God who has stepped aside to allow such a situation to develop that they could have easily prevented. But if you believe that everything happens in furtherance of God's plan, then he didn't just stand aside, he is directly responsible. And so in your quest for such justifications, you wind up with apologists saying horrendous shit like this.
It was actually a tremendous blessing to these children for them to be killed and go to heaven and be with God.
An atheist is kind of at a place where their worldview is forcing them to deny that scary reality.
Absolutely not. I am perfectly comfortable saying that torturing babies is always wrong. I can even say that if maximizing well-being and minimizing harm are goals that we can agree on, then by using that as the measuring stick, it is objectively wrong. And this is probably what he was referring to when he said that we have to play word games with subjective and objective, but this isn't a word game. The goal, maximizing well-being and minimizing harm, is subjectively chosen, but whether an action gets you closer to that goal or farther away from it can be objectively measured. Of course, this does mean that morality is ultimately subjective, as even this objective measurement relies on the choosing of a subjective goal, but unlike Mike, I don't then say, I don't like that it's not ultimately objective, therefore it must be wrong, because I recognize that my dislike of a concept does not alter reality to make that concept untrue.
Why is it scary? Because it also means that things I'm doing are wrong.
Well, if my definition of wrong is what we're going with here, which would be taking actions that move us away from the goal of maximizing well-being and minimizing harm, then if I am doing something wrong, I want to know about it so that I can stop. The problem here is that you're using a definition of right and wrong that doesn't appear to have any basis in reality. If I am not convinced that your God even exists, then why should I care that you say he thinks it's wrong for me to have sex without being married? I care about actual harm done to actual people, not the arbitrary opinion of a being that can't even be shown to exist. And for the record, I do recognize some of the problems with utilitarianism that could lead to immoral actions being called good by way of moral math, but the nuances to my position aren't really relevant to this video, so I'll just leave a link to a video where I went more in depth on the topic. Be gentle in the comments on that one, though. That was the first video that I made after making the decision to transition to being on camera in my videos, and the camera work reflects that.
There's many atheists that would actually agree and say, like Sam Harris, say, hey, consciousness is an illusion. You don't really exist. You just think you do.
Consciousness is the one thing in this universe that cannot be an illusion. Oh, sorry, I should have prefaced that. That is a direct quote from an article that Sam Harris wrote on his blog about the nature and implications of consciousness. This isn't Sam's book. I know it's a convincing facsimile of Sam's books, but I never really got into his stuff even when I was into the Four Horsemen of Atheism thing. So I printed out a blog article and stuffed it in a book so that I could say that with an air of intellectual superiority. Now, he does go on in the article to explain that there is no physical evidence for consciousness. A physical examination of the brains that contain consciousnesses can show us a complex system of feedback, reaction, interaction, and whatnot, but it will not yield an answer to the question, what is it like to be that brain? This is the problem of solipsism. I, personally, have no conclusive physical evidence that any conscious minds exist in the universe aside from my own. I can logically infer that other beings that behave in a similar fashion as I do have consciousnesses, because I see no reason why I would be the only one. But what if those other beings are themselves illusory in nature? I know that brains have imperfect perception, and that certain drugs will alter that perception such that I can induce experiences that are entirely hallucinatory in nature. So how do I know that this is not what is making me think that the entire universe exists? And my answer is simply that I don't think I'm special enough for me to be the lone inhabitant of the universe. This might be philosophically naive, but when push comes to shove, it doesn't actually matter. My experience of the universe is such that I feel confident in believing that other conscious beings exist, and if I start behaving as though this is incorrect, then whether I'm right or wrong, it will have a negative impact on my experience, and whether reality outside of my experience is real or not, my experience itself is real. And I'd prefer that that experience be positive rather than negative. So it works out in my favor to act as though the world is real, regardless of whether or not that conclusion is correct. And, oh, god damn it. I've gone and put more thought into Mike's words than Mike has again. Okay. Sam Harris literally said the exact opposite of what Mike just said that he said. End of story. No clarification required. We're done here.
Who's the you thinking you do? I don't know, because that would require a you. It's self-refuting, but at any rate, you don't exist, and you're just having a delusion that you are, which again is self-refuting.
No, hard solipsism is not self-refuting. Well, I'm assuming that that's what he's talking about rather than the absolutely ridiculous statement that he's actually making. This stuff can be hard to parse out sometimes, and I can see how a description of solipsism could lead one to think that it equates to a belief that consciousness is an illusion. So if you're stuck on the bottom rung of apologetics like Mike is, conflating those things is kinda expected. But yeah, solipsism is not self-refuting, it's more of a thought experiment. And what's more, it's not even linked to atheism. Just because you can name an atheist that pointed out that it's difficult, if not impossible, to conclusively refute solipsism using physical evidence, does not mean that it's the default atheist position. Hell, if I actually accepted solipsism, I wouldn't even bother making videos like this. What is the point in arguing with people who don't even exist?
But guys like Daniel Dennett, atheist philosopher, would agree there is no consciousness on atheism.
I very much doubt that Dennett would actually agree with that, given that he has written and spoken extensively about the difficulty in fully communicating the experience of consciousness, explaining it like a cell phone. You can ask me what's going on in my head, and I can tell you, but no matter what I say, it will not give you the full picture. There's a myriad of thoughts, experiences, emotions, sensations, perceptions, etc. that are impossible for me to fully communicate, just as watching a YouTube video on your phone doesn't fully explain which transistors in the phone's processor are on or off, when they switch, what bits are stored in RAM, whether or not it will switch which tower it's connected to for improved signal, and so on. Your phone is always doing stuff that, even if you are the most qualified of experts in all the relevant fields, you'll just not be able to be aware of. And consciousness is like that. The most qualified experts can study it, learn about it, and figure out different aspects of how it works, but ultimately, we can't ever fully learn about someone else's subjective experience externally. This does not mean that consciousness does not exist. It means it's difficult to study and quantify.
I think atheism is denying the obvious here. I think they're denying reality in order to support atheism.
And I think you haven't put in enough work to figure out what atheists actually think on the matter. Even if we did assume that Dennett and Harris were accurate representatives of what is apparently the monolith of atheist thought, which, to be clear, they absolutely are not, and atheist thought is not a monolith. You literally said that Sam Harris believes the exact opposite of what he actually said, and are now using that to back up your earlier statement that you don't think that atheists even have each other. Since you need to either lie or be so grossly incompetent as to not be capable or willing to do the 2 seconds of Googling to figure out whether or not you're saying a true thing in order to reach that conclusion, you have effectively demonstrated that your belief about atheist beliefs is itself an exercise in denying reality.
I think they have a belief in atheism that forces them to reject obvious truths about reality, moral values and duties, consciousness. How about purpose? True purpose.
I don't deny that my life has purpose. I just get to make the choice of what my purpose is for myself, rather than having to accept whatever purpose you think God has for me.
We have a real purpose and a function in life. Now that can be scary because if you have a purpose, you can be failing that purpose.
So what is that purpose, Mike? You had this in a list of things that are supposedly obvious truths about reality, which either means that my purpose is so generic that it can apply to anyone, so that would be the Christian view that our purpose is just to serve God, blah blah blah, boring, or it's something that is specially tailored to me, but it's an obvious fact about reality, so anyone who knows me should be able to tell what it would be, unless it's only obvious to me? In which case, how is that different from me choosing my own purpose? I do what I'm passionate about, and that's what seems to obviously be my purpose to me, so who are you to say that I'm wrong?
But on atheism, you must deny your purpose.
No, I must deny the purpose that you think applies to me, but which is not at all obvious to me.
Beauty. No real beauty on atheism. Objective beauty.
I'm not even sure that objective beauty is a coherent concept. Beauty is what I find to be aesthetically pleasing. This is an entirely subjective experience. It is so obviously a subjective experience that the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is a tired cliche. There are things that I think are beautiful that other people disagree with, and vice versa. If sentient alien life exists, it probably looks nothing like us, and would not find anything about the human form to be aesthetically pleasing. So no matter how much I might think it's an objective fact about reality that Scarlett Johansson is beautiful, these aliens would probably not agree with me. And I know of no atheists who deny that beauty exists. But to claim that beauty is somehow objective when it is so very obviously subjective is just strange.
He then describes religion and says it comes from, catch this, religion's origin, it comes from our hatred for our loathsome existence and our deep desire to deny the actuality of death and of future loss.
While that is a bit more of a bleak outlook on life than I have, it is a fact of reality that religion tends to do better in populations that live in poverty than in ones that have relative abundance. And while correlation does not necessarily equal causation, there is reason to believe a causal link in this case. To quote the Pew Research 2018 report, in places where people face a constant threat of premature death due to hunger, war, or disease, feelings of vulnerability tend to drive people to religion, which in turn provides hope and reduces anxiety. In countries with advanced economies, meanwhile, people are more likely to feel safe, in part because technology and infrastructure investment in these societies have helped people overcome many common health problems, cope with severe weather, and deal with other types of emergencies that can cause existential anxiety. Combine this with how religion ostensibly helps with the loss of loved ones, and it certainly begins to look like humans have a tendency to turn to religion in an attempt to comfort themselves with the idea that someone is in control, and even if things suck now, that someone will make everything work out for the best. So, while the article you're responding to didn't exactly put it in the best possible terms, the point that they were driving at does appear to be accurate when you actually look at the data.
Yet atheism also has a rejection of future loss, which is hell and judgment and standing before God.
Rejection of a future loss that cannot be demonstrated to actually be real in any meaningful sense is in no way the same as turning to religion out of desperation and a need for comfort and relief from the horrible situations in this life. To pretend that it is disingenuous.
I've met atheists who are very happy at the idea that they will have no eternal life because they think it would be unpleasant, especially hell, or they have weird views of heaven.
While I can't exactly say that I'm happy about my future non-existence, it is preferable to either of the Christian options, yes.
Like they think heaven would be bad and boring and they don't want to be there, and I just think you're not really thinking about that. Like maybe your view of heaven is like that, harps and clouds and singing 24/7. And that's from a Bugs Bunny cartoons when you were a kid. Like that's not from scripture.
What is from scripture then? It's made out of precious gems and metals for some reason, which would be super gaudy and cause them to not be valuable. That's actually a running theme in Christianity, the complete lack of awareness that scarcity is a crucial part of the value equation. Everything in heaven will be made out of these super valuable materials. Okay? Why? It wouldn't look nice, and everyone having unlimited access to it would mean that you can't trade it for anything, and you're not even supposed to want for anything in heaven anyway, so why would having so much gold be a good thing in the first place? But the Christian failure to understand basic economics is irrelevant here. The Bible says so little about what heaven will actually be like that any time an apologist or preacher talks about it, they are inevitably just making shit up. And I've been to enough church services where that was attempted to have seen how different the picture of heaven can be from person to person. Like, the actual biblical description is just a physical description of a city, New Jerusalem, which is supposed to be very pretty. It's got a great high wall with 12 gates, it's a square that is about 2,200 kilometers long on each side, the walls are jasper, but the city itself is pure gold, the gates are adorned with different kinds of jewels, there's no sun or moon because God is shining on it all day, every day. There won't be a night, blah, blah, blah. Such a bland description. there is next to nothing about what people will actually be doing in heaven. Now, we can draw inferences from some things, like how in Matthew 22:23-33, the Sadducees asked Jesus about a woman who had been married to 7 men who all died in what I'm sure were not at all suspicious ways, wondering whose wife she would be when they're all in heaven, with Jesus answering that in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. So there's no marriage in heaven, presumably meaning there's also no sex. Also, whatever permanent injuries or disabilities you suffer in this life will be carried over into heaven, as Jesus said in Matthew 18:8-9, that if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, because it's better to enter life crippled or lame than to go to hell with both hands and feet. Same goes for eyes. And that's basically it. From this, preachers are left to their own imaginations in creating heaven, and they all go about it differently, with most ignoring the "you keep earthly wounds" part. I've heard preachers say that it'll be like a permanent worship service, that it'll be just like this life but without any of the bad things, so you still have a job but you'll love your job and find it perfectly fulfilling. You'll still have your family and loved ones. You'll either have your memory of the loved ones in hell wiped, or somehow you'll be changed to be happy about them being in hell. It'll be like a life where you get to do anything you want anytime you want, but everything you want to do will be sinless things. And there's a bunch more descriptions that I've heard that don't all get along with each other as well. Christians can't even agree on what heaven will be like. So why should I take you seriously when you explain what it's not like?
Christianity comes from obvious facts about God and morality, which we would call natural revelation.
Which are only obvious if you start with their truth as an a priori assumption and ignore all the data to the contrary, like the fact that morality is very much not a universally agreed upon concept. Of course, you get to dismiss that as being the result of the fall, but this has the effect of making it a completely unfalsifiable claim. It can never be proven wrong, because anytime we agree on morality, that's clearly because God wrote it on our hearts. But anytime we disagree, that's clearly because of our fallen nature. How could a concept that slippery possibly count as evidence for anything? Like, these facts about morality are only obvious if you don't actually think about them at all. As soon as you put any thought into them, they become much more complicated and less obvious, so that's out the window. Obvious facts about God were also a part of that, to which I would just ask, what obvious facts? The attributes of God will change depending on who you ask. Mike Winger, Steven Anderson, and the Pope all call themselves Christians, and yet when you ask them to describe God, they will each describe a different being with different attributes. Sure, there will be some in common, but there will also be pretty massive differences. And which attributes are in common and which are different will shift as you ask different Christians for a description of God. So clearly, these attributes aren't obvious facts about God.
Right? You can arrive at that through critical thinking.
You'll just arrive at very different conclusions from nearly every other Christian on the planet, because, as it turns out, each Christian tends to think that God agrees with them, and then disagrees with all the other ones. And research has shown that when a person's beliefs evolve, their beliefs about God's beliefs evolve with them, and originates in the same area of the brain that their own beliefs come from, rather than from the area of the brain that their evaluation of other people's beliefs comes from. To parse that out, when people think of their own beliefs, an area of the brain that is associated with self-referential thinking is activated. When thinking about other people's beliefs, this area is not activated. When thinking about God's beliefs, the self-referential area is active again. When the same person has a change of heart on a particular matter, they continue to report that God agrees with them even after their change of heart, and the same brain activity happens. So these obvious facts about God end up being obvious because they are in perfect alignment with what that person who believes in God already believes for themselves, rather than being obvious because they are objective facts about reality.
And 2, special revelation through Jesus and the Bible, which can be historically proven and critically looked at, textually proven.
Proven is very strong language there, Mike. There's more evidence for the claims made by Joseph Smith than there is for Jesus' resurrection, if only because he was writing so much more recently. But one wouldn't expect that to be a problem for an all-powerful God that actually existed, right?
There's actually a whole area of research that's just like the textual connections in Scripture about the unity of the Bible that goes even beyond my Jesus in the Old Testament stuff.
Really? Well, I'd be interested in seeing some of that scholarship, especially given that the way we figure out whether some of the New Testament books attributed to Paul were authentic was by examining the message to see how unified it was, and found that some of the books espoused positions that ran counter to Paul's positions in the authentic books. So, given that the disunity of the message between various Bible books is an important metric for figuring out details about the books themselves, like who wrote them, when they were written, what sect of Judaism or Christianity were the author's target audience, and more, I would be very surprised indeed to find these scholars agreeing that there is perfect unity of message throughout the whole of the Bible.
At any rate, you have a special revelation of God in Christ, and that's also recorded in the scripture, which means that Christianity is based on the idea that God has revealed himself to us.
Well, that's nice and all, but if that idea turns out to be false, then that idea ceases to matter in the slightest.
And we can confirm this by looking at these sort of miraculous elements in the religion.
Yeah, it's a miracle that when you ask a Christian who believes the Bible has one single unified message, whether or not the Bible has one single unified message, they will tell you that it does, even though scholars will use the lack of a unified message to figure out actual true things about the Bible. Christian scholars at that. I'm not talking about atheist scholars here. This is just how the scholarship surrounding the text of the Bible works, and most of the scholars engaged in this study are themselves Christian. For every Bart Ehrman, there's 10 Dale Allisons. And yet apologists like Mike Bottom-Rung Winger ignore all the scholarship in order to promote simplistic ideas about how the Bible is actually just one unified book.
Is there some loss that atheists might be trying to deny? Yes. Judgment and control over their lives that God would have.
Yes. To repeat, atheists deny the existence of a future loss that you will only find out for sure exists after you die, while the loss that Christians deny is the actual loss that happens when a loved one dies. We deny a hypothetical loss that is claimed to exist without evidence. You deny a real loss that nearly everyone experiences in their life. These are not equivalent. You can argue that you don't deny the real loss if you like, and I'd actually be inclined to agree because of what I said earlier. Christians grieve just as hard for their lost loved ones as atheists do. But then that takes away one of the defenses of religion that even atheists can be found promoting, the idea that it helps people cope with loss. Even to the extent that it does accomplish this, I don't think that a denial of reality that the loss is actually a loss is really helping someone process their grief. Now, that said, it would be hypocritical of me to ignore the fact that there is research on the subject, and that research has found that a belief in the afterlife and in a controlling force guiding our life events, not to mention the community of like-minded believers that offer support, does indeed have a positive impact on a person's ability to cope with the loss of a loved one or the idea of them future dying. But notably, as with most of the research that comes to the conclusion that there are positive mental health effects of religion, this was not specific to any particular religion. So, Mike, I presume that you would agree that non-Christian religions that believe in an afterlife are not true, correct? So why then do the positive effects of religious belief not remain constrained within the one true religion? Not all religions can be true, but they can all be false. And even if I grant that a belief in the afterlife does really help people properly and fully process their grief, it still remains a true statement that this is a false belief that denies reality. And I'm sure Mike could agree with that statement about the beliefs of the non-Christian afterlives. So given that, can he really say that the atheist position that the exact same thing applies to Christianity is unfounded?
Is there some loss that Christians could be trying to deny? Yes, they could be trying to deny that they're going to die and then cease to exist.
Yeah, okay, that too. I forgot about the existential aspect of it. My bad. I guess it's a bit closer to being comparable to an atheist denying the afterlife, but it remains a demonstrable fact that everyone will die at some point. But the claim of an afterlife has no such evidence.
But does that mean they are? Because there is some loss that could be there. No, there's evidential reasons to support Christianity.
I haven't seen any good evidential reasons to support Christianity. Are you planning on providing any anytime soon?
This argument assumed atheism was true and concluded it was true.
Yeah, projection again. That is entirely what you have been doing with Christianity through this whole series.
However, if we can be united in our dissociation from real life, assumes atheism is true, we can be happy. We can call this dissociation faith, and together we can be free from the horror of existence. Religion allows people to forget that we are on a rock zipping through the cosmic abyss at hundreds of kilometers per second, and that eventually our sun won't even exist, and our planet will not even be a memory. And this truth is something that people desperately scurry away and hide from.
Existential dread is real, and while I generally wouldn't phrase it like the article has, because unlike Mike, I don't want to come across as a condescending asshole, the point it's getting at is a very real one. Even if there are psychological benefits to believing in an afterlife, the fact remains that it doesn't matter which one you believe in. The benefits are the same across the board. So you would likely agree with me if I were to say that a Muslim is denying reality, because both of us can agree that the afterlife in Islam is not real. So either way, it's still a reality denial. But yeah, all that stuff about how fast the sun is moving and whatnot is largely irrelevant.
Now, let me just say that does not describe Christianity. What he's described there is more like Buddhism.
So you don't agree with all the Christian apologists who assert that if this life is the only one we get, then it's effectively meaningless? That's interesting.
Buddhism does actually have a view that they want to escape, right? escape. That is the goal of Buddhism and different branches in Hinduism.
I've seen Buddhists who will happily agree that Buddhism is a form of escapism and are entirely unbothered by that accusation. But I'd also be willing to bet that there are Buddhists who disagree. Probably the same for Hinduism, with what I understand of it, but ultimately, I don't really give a shit. I'm not here to attack or defend Buddhism or Hinduism. I'm here to respond to the ideas that Mike is putting forward. And to say, essentially, but other religions are a form of escapism as well, doesn't really take away from the fact that pretending you'll go to a happy place and be reunited with all of your loved ones when you die is also a form of escapism.
The idea is this whole experience is torture, and we want to get out of it by not caring about it, by transcending it, and by escaping this reality.
Are you saying that that does not apply to Christianity? That is fundamentally what is at the base of every worldview that has some form of paradise as a reward at some point. In Buddhism, it's mainly that desire is the basis for suffering, so if we can teach ourselves to no longer have desires, then we will reach a point where we will no longer be suffering. And this point is nirvana. In Christianity, if you're besties with Jesus when you die, then whatever you may have suffered in your life won't even matter. It's all gone, and you've got eternal paradise to look forward to. These are two forms of escapism that have the same goal: get away from suffering. One does it through the elimination of desire, the other does it through the ultimate fulfillment of desire. And honestly, if I'm examining this as an outsider, at least the Buddhist one has principles that can lessen your suffering in this life if you follow them, so Buddhism seems better if I were forced to choose.
And then you just kind of stop existing. That is the goal in Buddhism.
I don't know that the cessation of existence is the actual goal, but at least if atheism is true, then it's the end result no matter what. So again, may as well do what we can to make this life as pleasant as possible for as many people as possible.
There's different branches in Buddhism, but that is the goal in Buddhism, at least in a prominent number of Buddhists.
And I'm sure that given your stellar track record thus far representing ideas you disagree with, that this prominent number of Buddhists will have no issues with what you say?
Okay, that would be a desire to escape the horror of existence. I get that.
No, that would be the quest to abstain from desire so that the horror of existence loses its power over you.
However, this is not Christianity in any way, shape, or form.
So you don't believe in an eternal happy place that you'll go to once this life is over, where there will be no more suffering and no more pain and no more death and all that?
Christians are very sober and real about suffering and about the difficulties of life and about how hard it is and how bad things are. That's definitely true.
So are Buddhists. I don't think I've ever heard a Buddhist deny that life is hard and full of suffering. An acknowledgement of this fact is kind of their whole thing, with the desire causes suffering, so if you learn not to have desires, you'll just cease to suffer. Just because you disagree with their methods doesn't mean that they don't agree that suffering exists.
Look at how the atheist describes reality here. The reality is, all we have is each other, connection, and this life. Anything more is hopeful delusions. Is there evidence supported for this? No, it's pure assertion. It's indoctrination based on the definition I offered earlier. It is not critical thinking.
I sort of agree. I would rephrase it to say that our best evidence indicates that interpersonal connection in this life is all we have. There is no evidence for anything beyond it, so make the most of it. That way it's less dismissive while still getting effectively the same point across.
That's all we have. However, there's a problem. On atheism, we don't have each other. We don't have connection, and we don't really have this life, because on atheism, I think the consistent atheist would say that I'm not really here.
Why would the consistent atheist say that, though? I mean, sure, you seem to think that Sam Harris thinks that, but you never explained why it is that this would actually be consistent with atheism. You just said that's what Harris thinks and then moved on as though Harris thinking it would make it true for all atheists somehow.
In fact, if you want to grant consciousness, I think consciousness itself, human consciousness, is an argument for God's existence, a strong one.
I would actually agree that it's one of the strongest ones. So the fact that making physical and chemical alterations in the brain makes corresponding alterations to the consciousness with no apparent external controlling force is pretty damning, as that renders it a pretty weak bit of evidence. If your strongest evidence is pretty weak, then what's that say about the rest of it?
Right, but if I'm just a meat robot, if I'm just brain and chemicals firing, then I'm not even the same Mike who started recording this video.
And if your brain has its corpus callosum severed, then the left side of your brain won't even be the same Mike as the right side of your brain. Again, you not liking these facts does not render them untrue. Besides, as I learn new things, I grow as a person. I am not the same Vice Rhino who started this YouTube channel, and for that, I am greatly thankful. I'm a much better person than I was back then, because I've continued to learn and grow. I do not mourn the loss of 2016 me, that guy was a dick. Instead, I rejoice at the possibility of what 2025 me could be.
It's not even a consistent I don't continue to even exist from second to second. I'm just the firing of chemicals and electrons in my mind. I'm not even a me. So we don't have each other on atheism.
There being a physical explanation for our subjective experiences does not negate the very existence of those experiences, and I don't understand why you think that it would.
Number 5. Okay, this is the hardest argument.
Because it took the most Viagra, you see.
And it comes from Epicurus. And however, I'll preface it with this. This version of the argument of evil is like the most cringy version of it, but I'm going to talk about it in more detail.
This far in, I think it's safe to say that the only version of any argument that Mike is capable of properly discussing is, in fact, the cringiest version of that argument. At first in this series, I was kind of wondering why Mike was going after such a poorly written article, but now it makes sense. The bad article is absolutely trouncing Mike, as he fails to even respond to the actual argument being made at least half of the time, with the actual responses being so shallow and sloppy that it makes the money shot in a porn scene seem deep and clean by comparison.
Okay, so Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher as well as the founder of the school of philosophy called Epicureanism. Only a few fragments and letters of Epicurus's 300 written works remain.
And worth mentioning is that the Epicurean trilemma is not found among these works, and the oldest attribution we have of this trilemma to Epicurus comes from the 3rd century Christian author Lactantius, who was writing some 600 years after Epicurus would have lived. From what we actually know of Epicurus, he wouldn't have been an atheist. He was just of the opinion that any gods that might exist would not even concern themselves with human affairs. Now, this is concordant with the trilemma, but it's important to realize that if the trilemma did originate with Epicurus, then it was not an argument against the existence of any gods, it was an argument against the existence of an interventionist god. It's a small distinction, to be sure, but it's still one that's worth making, if for no other reason than making sure we fully understand the nuances of the argument. Also, I should probably point out that one of the reasons we have so few of Epicurus' own writings is because early Christians actively destroyed them because they viewed them as the works of atheism, and we can't have that.
And here's the quote from Epicurus. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he's not omnipotent, because he doesn't have the power to do it. If he's able, but not willing, then he is malevolent. I would argue against that, and I will in a moment.
Of course you will, because you have to contend with the existence of a world that very obviously doesn't have an omnipotent benevolent being watching out for it, all while believing that an omnipotent benevolent being is watching out for it.
But if he's both able and willing, then whence cometh evil? There's a whole actual argument in response to that, interestingly enough.
Yeah, there is. How much do you want to bet that it's one that relies on consequentialist ethics to say that God has done the moral math and determined that allowing a certain amount of evil now will result in a greater good being brought about later? Because even the most ardent supporters of divine command theory retreat to consequentialism as their justification for God allowing or commanding evil. Divine command theory, for those who don't know, is basically the idea that anything God does or commands is morally good for no other reason than it is God commanding or doing it, because God is the source of morality and, as such, cannot do or command anything that is not morally good. But those who claim to hold this view can often be found attempting to justify God's actions or commands by appealing to either how morally degraded the people he was acting against were, or by a future greater good that is brought about by allowing evil now. Neither of those is consistent with divine command theory. God commanded or did it, therefore it's good regardless of the consequences, because God is the source of good, so no appeal to an overall increase in what we humans consider to be good is necessary to justify God's actions.
Is he neither able nor willing, then why call him God?
And that last line is really where this trilemma doesn't seem to fit in with what we know of Epicurean philosophy. Gods are real, they exist, they are just so far above us that they aren't even aware of our existence. But we can still learn lessons from them, striving to emulate the moral character of the good gods in our lives. But from the gods' perspectives, it'd be like an ant trying to imitate the morality of a human whose house it lives under. If the human even notices that the ant exists, they aren't really going to pay close enough attention to notice that this ant is trying to emulate them. It's just an ant. The human might even carelessly squish the ant, never having become aware of that ant's feelings towards the human. This would look like a great evil from the ant's perspective, but from the human's perspective, it's morally neutral. It was just an ant after all. But I digress. We've already seen Mike fail to even try and have a cursory understanding of some relatively modern philosophy, so why would we expect him to know any of this about Epicureanism?
The argument is that God can't be either he's not good or he's not powerful. And it's impossible for God to be good and powerful at the same time, because he would have stopped all this evil stuff that goes on.
So here's the thing. I do consider the problem of evil to be a fairly powerful argument against God, but I'm also willing to acknowledge that it does have a relatively easy to discover fatal weakness from anyone who holds to a variant of consequentialist ethics. An all-knowing, all-powerful being would know exactly what scenario it could create that would bring about the largest possible set of positive consequences. And it is hypothetically possible for a world with as much apparent suffering as ours has to be the world that brings that about, and without knowing absolutely everything myself, I cannot refute that. But as a consequentialist, I can say with 100% certainty that the Christian God did not create such a scenario. Unless you consider the vast majority of people who ever have or ever will exist going to eternal torture in hell to be a good consequence, because Jesus made it quite clear that most people will go to hell when they die, when he said, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." Now, if you actually subscribe to divine command theory, then this isn't a problem. We don't need to worry about the outcome being a greater good for humanity. God sending most people to hell is a good thing because it's God that did it. But as we see anytime an apologist is asked about the Old Testament genocides, that's not how they actually think about things. They justify God's immoral actions by appealing to a greater evil that would have been the outcome of God's failure to act.
We need to understand this was not an arbitrary ethnic cleansing. But in fact, this is a specific judgment on a morally degraded people.
God's command for Israel to drive out the Canaanites was not race-based, but behavior-based, as the Canaanites engaged in acts that would be considered criminal in civilized societies.
First, it starts off with incest, and then it goes into adultery, then it goes into offering your children to Molech, homosexual sins, and then bestiality. And we know from Canaanite primary source documents that all of these things were being practiced by the Canaanites.
He gives reasons, right? He doesn't just wake up like a mob boss and go, "Canaanites, I want them dead," right? He's got reasons for it. And probably the biggest reason, after 400 years of warning, is that the Canaanites were sacrificing their children on the molten hot god Molech, this idol.
It'll never cease to amaze me that these apologists seem to think that a reasonable justification for committing genocide is their practice of child sacrifice. Like, it's bad that they kill some of their babies, therefore it's good that the ancient Hebrews killed all of their babies. Anyway, yeah, the answer to the problem of evil is that, if you believe in consequentialist ethics, God has made sure that he created the universe with the maximum amount of good as the ultimate outcome. We just lack the knowledge required to be able to see that. But this has a whole host of other problems when we get to the specifics of the Christian God.
Whenever you're given a dilemma, this is a dilemma. Actually, it's a quadrilemma, right? You're given 4 options and you're being told these are your only options.
Well, when phrased properly, it's actually a trilemma that pits each of the 3 omni-properties of God, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and omniscience, against the realities of the world. If God is omniscient and omnipotent, then he knows of all evil and can stop it, but does not, so cannot be omnibenevolent. If God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, then he wants to stop evil and can do so, so if evil exists, then he cannot be omniscient, as the only reason not all evil would be eliminated in this scenario is if God doesn't know of all evil. If God is omniscient and omnibenevolent, then he knows all the evil that exists and wants to stop it, so the continued existence of evil means that God cannot be omnipotent. Notice that this does not preclude the existence of a God who simply lacks one or more of the omni characteristics. The "then why call him God" question at the end is a later addition that ignores the fact that, in the vast majority of religions throughout history, the gods that they believed in did not have these 3 omni characteristics simultaneously. That's a comparatively recent religious development. So for most of human history, a god did not have to have all 3 of these omnis in order to be considered a god.
The first thing you need to ask is things like, do I actually have other options? Are these really my only 4 options?
No, those aren't your only options. As I already pointed out, there are at least 2 other options here. Either divine command theory is correct, and therefore anything we consider to be evil is permitted by God to exist, so is actually good. I'd argue that this includes human actions that Christians generally think of as evil, because God actively created those people knowing exactly what they would do in their lives, so all the actions that the people take in their lives are God's actions by proxy. If God didn't want those actions to be taken, he wouldn't have made the people that take them. So in this view,
everything that exists and that happens within that existence is good, because God is responsible for everything existing, and everything God does or commands is definitionally good. Or the other option that I see is that consequentialist ethics are correct, and God has created the world that will result in the ultimate maximization of good, even if it requires the occasional Holocaust to get us there. A third alternative, of course, is just that God does not exist and humanity is on its own when it comes to figuring out ethics. That's the one that I think works best with our observations about reality, but I don't think that's one that Mike is willing to consider.
Look, you either give me $50 or you give me $100. It's up to you. Okay, are those really my only two options? And in that case, obviously no.
I'll grant that that was a valid analogy for a false dilemma, but it wasn't a very good one. Here's what I think is a better example. When you die, you either go to heaven or hell. This ignores the possibilities of there being nothing, reincarnation, continuing to exist as a ghost, going to purgatory, or any number of other potential afterlife options. Sure, Christians who actually believe what they preach will think that this is a true dilemma, but that just brings us back to the apparent inability of apologists to create accurate hypotheticals from perspectives other than Christianity. From the atheist perspective, heaven and hell don't exist, so to say that we're going to one or the other is nonsensical. Sure, maybe the atheists are wrong, but that doesn't mean that Christianity wins by default. Hell, I've even known one woman who called herself an atheist who believed that we are actually all immortal interdimensional beings who insert themselves into mortal life and then wipe their memories of their interdimensional existence as a form of entertainment. So when we die, we just continue being interdimensional immortals. She didn't believe that these beings are gods, and didn't believe in what we would call gods, so I guess she was technically an atheist, but that's not exactly a common belief among atheists. So if she is correct, then most atheists are wrong, but the correct answer still ended up being an atheist one.
So let's look at this again and just ask, is there another option? How about this? How about a very biblical option, which is that God allows evil temporarily, and he brings goods out of that scenario. He's accomplishing good things during the time where evil's going on. He's working it together for good, like Romans 8:28 says, and that he will put an eventual stop to evil, and then there'll be a new heaven and new earth wherein righteousness dwells. This is a major theme in the scripture.
Well, it's interesting that Romans 8:28 is your go-to verse to support that idea, because it explicitly states that this is only applicable to believers. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So, as it turns out, this isn't an option that is outside of the trilemma. This is, in fact, option one of the trilemma. God is omniscient and omnipotent, but not omnibenevolent. His benevolence is limited to those who love him. But it's also demonstrably false, at least on a personal level. For me, I did love God when I was a Christian. But my life has gotten way better as an atheist. I have more friends with deeper connections than I had when I was a Christian. I make more money than I ever did as a Christian. Like, I'm not wealthy unless we start comparing me to people in developing nations, but as much as I joke about how expensive it is to feed 5 children, I'm not worried that I won't be able to like I was when I was a Christian making minimum wage with only 1 kid. I don't have to worry about being bigoted against people that Christian leaders say we should be bigoted against for no other reason than a couple passages in a book that was written 2,000 plus years ago. I don't have to be worried that learning a cool new scientific fact will have an impact on the central beliefs of my life, because I can make learning as much as possible a core value, rather than having to try and fit new facts within a rigid and unyielding belief structure. And all of these are ways in which my life improved after I stopped being a Christian, and the list is not exhaustive. But again, getting back to the apologist's inability to properly consider things from any perspective other than their own, I'm told over and over again by apologists that the reason I left Christianity is because of sex. And yes, I am currently living with my partner, and we are not married, but having experienced 16 years of monogamous marriage, the majority of which was spent as a believing Christian, I can tell you that the sex aspect of the relationship is functionally the same. I mean, yes, there are differences between my current partner and my wife, but that's not the kind of difference I'm talking about here. But I mentioned my wife, who most of you will be aware died suddenly at the age of 35 back in 2021. How can I say my life is better when such a bad thing happened? And true, I have experienced more loss as an atheist than I did as a Christian, but that's a function of time. Everyone who continues living will be more likely to experience a loss of this kind with each passing year, as their friends and loved ones age as well. And yes, 35 was tragically young, but that's part of the problem of evil. In a universe without a benevolent God caring for its denizens, such things are to be expected. But in the Christian worldview, God killed her at a time when he knew she would be condemned to hell, and so is now being tortured for all eternity. What good could be brought about through killing her that could justify that? Like, honestly, I've used that event to make content speaking out against the Christian God, so in all probability, the most likely outcome when it comes to number of souls saved as a result of her death will be a net negative. If Christianity is true, I've used that event in a way that will result in even more people being condemned to hell than if it never happened. Which kind of flies in the face of the whole God will make everything work out for the best thing. But also, even coming out on the other side of that dark time in my life, I am happy again. Yes, that was a wound that will likely never fully heal, but the one life I have to live goes on, and I've got wonderful people in my life that I love and support, and who love and support me. And given what I know of her cause of death, that would have happened at that time regardless of whether I was a Christian or not. But as an atheist, I don't have to worry about the afterlife logistics. Though, really, Jesus put that to rest by essentially saying that there'd be no marriage or sex in heaven anyway, in Matthew 22:23-33, when the Pharisees asked him about a similar logistical issue. So, yeah, all this to say that the Bible only says that God will make things work out for the best for believers, and that my life got better pretty much as soon as I stopped being a believer, so that is demonstrably false.
God using evil for good temporarily, and then bringing about an ultimate, wonderful, permanent state where there's no evil.
And this, actually, gets to my next problem with the proposed solutions to the problem of evil. God is supposed to be omnipotent, all-powerful, capable of doing anything. As Jesus says in Matthew 19:26, with man this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. Not most things, not only logically possible things, but all things. Which means that it was possible for God to create that ultimate, wonderful, permanent state where there's no evil right from the get-go. Which means that the only reason that evil exists, if this God exists, is because he wanted it to.
In fact, there are philosophers that will argue that the only way to have the optimal world is to first have a world or a season, a time where you have a suboptimal world so that suffering can exist, and then later you have your optimal world because you need there's benefits that come in suffering, and you need to carry those into that eternal world.
And the implication of there being a required world of suffering and evil in order for the optimal world to be truly optimal means that God cannot be all-powerful, because an ability to do all things, as Jesus said he could do, would include the ability to create this optimal world without requiring a world of suffering to come first. So if you want to believe that, then that's fine, but that belief includes the removal of the property of omnipotence from God. And I know some people will take issue with my pointing out that Jesus didn't stipulate that all things are possible with God, but that all things are limited to things that are logically possible, but I'd argue that that's a moot point here. There's nothing logically impossible about an optimal world existing without being preceded by a world full of suffering and evil. That whole argument relies on the way our brains work. A cold glass of water is better on a day that is insufferably hot than on a mild day, because of the contrast between being uncomfortably hot and the cool, refreshing feeling of the water. But it didn't have to be this way. God could have designed us in such a way that everything good is experienced optimally every time, without needing the contrast to make it better. But also, if our existence in heaven is still limited by how our brains function on Earth, requiring this contrast to make heaven seem that much better by comparison, then it's a reasonable expectation that our brains would also continue with their tendency to lose the emotional impact of a memory as time goes on, meaning that without some sort of reset that periodically provides more suffering, the great good of heaven will seem less good as time goes on, as the point of comparison grows more and more distant. Though this distancing of emotional impact from memories as time goes on has been hypothesized to be one of the functions of sleep. While sleeping, the neural connections associated with the emotional impact of the memory are weakened, while the connections associated with the details of the event are strengthened, which allows for the later recollection of the emotional event without the associated emotional reactivity. This is why sleep on it is good advice if you're angry about something. You're going to be less emotional about it, and so will be more able to think rationally after sleeping and make good decisions. And while the Bible doesn't explicitly state that there won't be any sleep in heaven, it does say in Revelation 21:23-24 that there will be no need of sun or moon because God will give it light, and there will be no night. Which, again, if we're limiting ourselves to the way human psychology works on Earth, I'm pretty sure that keeping bright lights on people while depriving them of sleep is a form of torture.
And I think there's a strong argument that can be made for that. Oddly enough, it's so biblical. That's what's trippy. It's so biblical. There's so many scriptures. I talk about them all the time.
I know. It's so surprising that the authors of the foundational book of the religion tried to incorporate answers to objections that had been used against other gods for hundreds of years before the New Testament was written. Though, really, you'd expect that if the Bible were actually given to us by an all-knowing, all-powerful God, it would have done a better job at this than it did.
About God using our suffering, about God working all things together for good, about how your character's being changed by the things you go through, all that kind of thing.
Okay, but once again, keep in mind that the Bible also says that most people go to hell. Hell is the ultimate bad experience, with no good brought about for you once you go there. So, by the Bible's admission, most of the bad experiences, when you total them all up, will result in no benefit to the person experiencing it. And there will be more people having these bad experiences than there will be people having good experiences in heaven. So, on balance, including the afterlife, the Christian worldview is that there will be significantly more people permanently suffering than people benefiting from having previously suffered but now enjoying eternal paradise that is made better by the memory of their suffering. If God were all-powerful, he could have created a system with no hell. So either he's not all-powerful, he wanted a world with way more suffering than was necessary, or none of this is actually real.
And you believe this too. You probably do already. That there's hard times in your life you went through that you look back on, and you would have wished them away if you could have. But you look back on it and you go, man, I'm so grateful for what I learned through that. I'm so grateful for the good that came out of that.
Sure there are, but there are also plenty of times that I look back on and say, yeah, I really could have done without that. That didn't actually have a net positive impact on my life. And while it is difficult for someone in as privileged a position as me to say specifically, my life would have been better if this had not happened, because my life is pretty darn good right now, it is important to recognize that the ability to say the hard times in my life worked out for the best is something that comes from a position of privilege. But people who live their entire lives in poverty and pain cannot say the same thing. People who suffer an injury or illness that permanently disables them, who end up not being able to make ends meet because they can't work anymore, cannot say the same thing. Families who are permanently separated by war cannot say the same thing. And I could keep going, but then this video would get super depressing. And yeah, there's that whole bootstraps mentality, the idea that luck doesn't really exist. Luck is just where preparation meets opportunity. But it doesn't matter how much you prepare if the opportunity never comes along, or if you prepared for a different kind of opportunity than the one that comes along, or if you mistake something for an opportunity when it wasn't and so are unable to take advantage of the actual opportunity that comes along afterwards. And yeah, once again, I could keep going with this. This is a callous response to the problem of evil that basically disregards most of the very real suffering that people have, treating every bad thing that could possibly happen to anyone as a potential opportunity for personal growth, when sometimes it's just that life sucks.
And there's other times you can't do that, right? You don't know what good came out of it. I'm not saying you can always figure it out. In fact, I'll argue against that. But at least you know it's possible, right? It's possible.
No, sometimes you know for sure that it's not possible. According to Christians, everyone who has died and not been a Christian is now suffering in eternal torture. What good will come of that? Are they experiencing personal growth in hell? Are they able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps all the way into heaven? If your answer is no, then you'd agree that not all suffering has this potential. Now, of course, I don't believe in an afterlife, so I only have to contend with the suffering in this life, and sometimes it is possible that things that seem bad in the moment actually do work out for the best. But I'd wager that that's actually the exception rather than the rule. Sure, it's the one that makes a more satisfying movie, so it's an idea that permeates our culture, but more often than not, a bad thing that happens is just a bad thing that happened. I didn't become extra resilient when my middle child almost died during childbirth and had to be resuscitated. I just had a bunch of stress that increased my risk of developing heart disease, diabetes, depression, and a bunch of other stuff.
And if it's possible that God might be doing something good through allowing the suffering and evil in the world temporarily, if that's even possible, then the logical problem of evil fails completely.
Maybe, but God isn't allowing suffering temporarily. Again, and I cannot stress this enough, according to the Bible, most people go to hell. In the Christian worldview, the afterlife has infinitely more suffering than this world ever could, and none of those people will experience a good benefit from that suffering.
And it has failed. The logical problem of evil is not used by pretty much any philosophers at all right now.
It sure would be embarrassing for Mike if I played a clip here of a modern philosopher, like, say, Dr. Michael Tooley, saying something along the lines of, the central argument for atheism is the argument from evil, wouldn't it?
The central argument for atheism, the argument from evil.
That same philosopher also published a paper in 2012 called Inductive Logic and the Probability That God Exists, Farewell to Skeptical Theism, which was a novel take on the inductive problem of evil, which Christian philosophers have since responded to, and which other philosophers, and Tooley himself again in 2022, responded to their responses. Almost like this is still an active area of discussion in philosophical circles. And this is all just a conversation around one single iteration of this argument, which has many different forms. Really, Mike, if the problem of evil were so utterly and thoroughly refuted, your best course of action would just be to explain the refutation. There wouldn't be this need for you to assert things that aren't true in order to attack the argument's popularity without addressing its points. I mean, I know he thinks he's about to address the point, so it's not so much a reverse argument from popularity, it's more of a poisoning the well. If you go into this discussion with the idea that modern philosophers don't actually take the problem of evil seriously, then even if you don't find Mike's answer satisfying, you can take comfort in the fact that professional philosophers don't think it's a problem, so a response that is satisfying, and does make sense, just must be out there somewhere. Except that's just not true. As I pointed out, it's still very much an active area of philosophical debate.
So you're given a dilemma. The dilemma is, are these my only options? And the answer is no, they're not. It could just be that God will eventually stop evil.
So this is where I'll admit that one of the issues with the version of the problem of evil that I've been presenting is the assumption that suffering continues to be evil, even if it's in the afterlife. I would argue that it still is, but that's where Mike would probably retreat to an iteration of divine command theory, where God did it so it can't be evil, or to an apologetic about how the people that go to hell choose their fate for themselves, which is a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to get into here.
God is all-powerful, God is all good, God is allowing evil, therefore he must have a reason, and he must be putting it to an end at some point.
You saying that these things necessitate God having a reason for allowing evil and planning to end it at some point, once again renders morality consequentialist in nature, rather than being derived from God's nature. If God were the source of all morality, then he doesn't need to justify his choice to allow evil. It cannot actually be evil if he allows it, because everything he does is definitionally good.
Both of those things are taught in Christianity. It may follow that if there's a true religion, it'll be a religion that offers a solution to the problem of evil because it's a significant issue.
I mean, yeah? That's kind of like saying if there's a true religion, it's the one that is true. Granted, some religions solve the problem of evil by just not having gods with the internally inconsistent omni characteristics in the first place. If there are a mix of good gods, evil gods, and neutral gods, all with approximately equal but limited power, then it stands to reason that the good gods won't be able to stop the evil gods from working their evil all the time, because it's just not possible for them. But that is still a solution to the problem. Atheism, though, has the advantage of not even having a problem of evil. Evil itself is a human construct. It's not a noun, something that exists in the universe. It's a description of conditions that we don't like. And why do conditions that we don't like exist? Because the universe is a big old messy place that doesn't care about us, and there's no all-powerful being looking out for us, so sometimes shit happens that we don't like.
And religion, Christianity in particular, does offer a solution to the problem of evil. Buddhism does not, for instance.
To the best of my knowledge, Buddhism doesn't have a problem of evil. There is no tri-omni god in Buddhism that would be looking out for us if it existed. Evil, or suffering rather, is caused by desire, and to eliminate suffering, you eliminate desire. It's all self-contained. Now, there is a sutra within Buddhism, the Tathagatagarbha, which sort of has a problem of evil. The text says that within every human is an intrinsically pure Buddha, so the problem specific to this doctrine, which is a fringe doctrine of Buddhism, not a mainstream one, is a question of why the intrinsically pure Buddha within everyone allows anyone to do evil at all. To which the answer is, as it so often is with any non-Abrahamic religion, that these pure Buddhas are not omnipotent. They can't stop you from following your desires, they just provide the twinge of conscience when you do evil.
Thor does not offer a solution to the problem of evil. There isn't a theodicy on Thor.
That's because, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, in a polytheistic worldview, there is no problem of evil, so it doesn't need to be solved, which is itself a solution of sorts.
By the way, let me talk about theodicies for a minute. A theodicy is an attempt to explain the problem of evil. It's something like the author said, it's been going on forever and ever, right? For thousands of years, they've been talking about theodicies, explaining the problem of evil.
And in those thousands of years, the theodicies have stayed largely the same. Like, In Callum Miller's response to Tooley's version of the problem of evil, he says, "It might be that the unknown properties of the action do not just outweigh the wrong-making properties, but actually negate the wrong-makingness of the wrong-making properties altogether, by integrating it into a complex whole in which it no longer has weight as a wrong-making property." That's basically modern philosopher speak for, we don't know how this could all work out for the best, but it could, so you can't say that God doesn't exist, because he might make everything work out for the best in a way that we just can't see. This response to the problem of evil goes back at least to the 16th century philosopher Michel de Montaigne, and hasn't changed a whole lot aside from just being rephrased into technical jargon. Others go back even farther, with ancient Roman authors writing defenses of the righteousness of their gods, and the ancient Greeks attributing evil to fate, which is a power beyond even that of the gods.
Soul building. There is a soul building theodicy, and philosophers have spent a lot of work on this.
Okay, fine. Go ahead and prove my point for me by appealing to a theodicy that goes back to at least the 2nd century church father Irenaeus and hasn't changed a whole lot since then.
And basically the idea is that suffering it causes growth of character. It causes opportunities to express courage. It allows for the opportunity to express the greatest kinds of love, and to do things like forgive.
All of which would be possible without the degree of suffering that we see in the world. And some of which aren't even necessarily things that inherently make the world a better place. Like forgiveness. Sure, forgiveness can be a good thing, but would living in a world where forgiveness is unnecessary because nobody does anything to anyone else that requires it be better? Like, I'd rather just not fight with my partner than to have a fight in order to experience the giving or receiving of forgiveness. And courage. Sure, we think of courage as a good thing because in this world of suffering, courage is often a necessary part of alleviating that suffering. Courage is the ability to do the right thing in spite of fear. Fear of something bad happening to you, and often the right thing in these scenarios is to put your own safety or well-being at risk in order to protect the safety or well-being of others. But would a world where everyone's safety and well-being is assured not be better? Also worth mentioning is that if forgiveness is such a great good that its existence justifies the existence of all the suffering and evil in the world, then you'd think that God would be able to offer forgiveness to anyone who sincerely repents of whatever they need forgiveness for, rather than only offering it to those who believe that he had his son brutally tortured to death so that he could forgive them while still satiating his bloodlust. It seems to me that forgiveness without requiring a punishment first is a greater virtue than forgiveness that is predicated on someone having to suffer because you're mad, even if it's the wrong someone.
Like if there wasn't any kind of evil or suffering in the world, then forgiveness wouldn't happen.
It wouldn't happen because it wouldn't need to happen. But also kinda not, because forgiveness could still happen without there being suffering or evil. If I'm out grocery shopping and I forget to buy milk, and now we're out of milk, my family can forgive me for my forgetfulness, even though not having milk in the house wasn't evil and didn't cause anyone any suffering.
Yet forgiveness is one of the most beautiful and wonderful goods out there.
I'd put a lot of caveats on that statement. Like, in my forgetting to buy milk scenario, my family forgiving me rather than getting annoyed at me would definitely be a good thing, but if I had a consistent habit of forgetting the milk and it regularly caused disruption, even if it is the fairly minor disruption of just having to have something other than cereal for breakfast, and I was making no effort to correct this forgetfulness, then forgiveness ceases to be a good thing and starts to become a weapon that I wield in order to get away with not having to put effort into changing or growing. Forgiveness is only a good thing if it is freely given by the person who was wronged. Vicarious forgiveness, where you just ask Jesus to forgive you for something you did to another person without apologizing to that other person, is not a good. And the people who are wronged do not automatically owe forgiveness to the person who wronged them. To guilt someone into forgiving someone who's hurt them is not a good thing. I'd argue that it's actually an evil thing, especially when you get into more serious things like abuse. So many people are convinced that forgiving their abuser is part of the healing process when it's not. And abusers will often weaponize this common perception by making a show of apologizing and being remorseful, which makes the victim feel like if they don't forgive them, then they're being a bad person, because forgiveness is good and they're clearly apologetic, so now they have an obligation to forgive. And that is not a good thing. The world would be a better place if shit like that did not happen.
I'm so grateful. Like I love God a lot more because of the forgiveness I've received in Christ than I would if he had just made me in heaven perfect.
How do you know that? How could you possibly know that? The only way to actually know that would be to have the experience of being made in heaven perfect in order to compare that experience to the one you have now. But also, that's not biblical. The Bible says in Ecclesiastes 4, 2-3, that it is better to be dead than to be alive, but better still would be to not have ever existed and seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. According to the Bible, the afterlife is not the best possible world for us to live in. It's better than life, sure, but better than both is to just never be born.
I just do. Like, there's a good that's coming out of the whole scenario of fall and forgiveness. So we wouldn't have this without suffering. You wouldn't grow without suffering. And children who live lives with no suffering end up being lousy adults.
Yeah, 4-year-old who died of leukemia, you would have been a lousy adult if you didn't suffer from leukemia.
And we know this. Maybe you are this.
Well, yes and no. Assuming that by suffering here, you mean a more generalized anything that feels bad in the moment, which would include things like, I'm angry that you're not letting me have candy for dinner, rather than what would typically be meant by suffering, because if you mean what we typically mean by suffering, then you've got a ridiculous position that is so nonsensical as to not even deserve a response. Anyway, there are 4 typical parenting styles: authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, and uninvolved. Authoritarian parents, quote, attempt to shape, control, and evaluate the behavior and attitudes of the child in accordance with a set standard of conduct, usually an absolute standard, theologically motivated, and formulated by a higher authority. They value obedience as a virtue and favor punitive, forceful measures to curb self-will at points where the child's actions and benefits conflict with what they think is right conduct. Permissive parents, quote, attempt to behave in a non-punitive, acceptant, and affirmative manner toward the child's impulses, desires, and actions. They make few demands for household responsibility and orderly behavior. They allow the child to regulate his own activities as much as possible, avoid the exercise of control, and do not encourage him to obey externally defined standards. Authoritative parents, quote, attempt to direct the child's activities but in a rational, issue-oriented manner. They encourage verbal give and take, and share with the child the reasoning behind their policy. And finally, uninvolved parents, quote, fulfill the child's basic needs while generally remaining detached from the child's life. An uninvolved parent does not utilize a particular disciplining style and has a limited amount of communication with their child. They tend to offer a low amount of nurturing while having either few or no expectations of their children. Of these styles, it is quite clear that authoritative parenting has the best outcomes for children. They will be more confident and responsible, they'll be able to effectively manage their negative emotions, have higher self-esteem, better academic performance, and more. The authoritarian style, which is the one that most closely resembles the parenting style that apologists generally advocate for, ends up with kids who will be well-behaved when an authority figure is present, but will be more aggressive, socially inept, unable to make decisions, have anger management issues, have poor self-esteem, and have a tendency to rebel against authority figures when older. And honestly, this makes sense to me. I went to a Christian high school. There is a cliche among Christian teenagers, or at least there was when I was one, that the pastor's kids, or PKs as they were called, were always rebellious little shits, though we probably wouldn't have used the term little shits. And what's worse, because they were so good at behaving in front of the authority figures, they could often get away with pretty much anything they wanted, because everyone in charge would just assume that because they were so well behaved, there was no way they could be involved in whatever scandalous behavior was being discovered. This seems like the kind of kid that would result from authoritarian parenting. The God set the absolute standard for behavior and you will obey, you do not need an explanation view, combined with Bible verses that encourage child abuse, like Proverbs 13:24, which says, he who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him, which very much suggests that the appropriate way to deal with disobedience is to beat them into submission. This fits the description of authoritarian parenting to a T. This style of parenting also fits the picture that apologists paint of God as our Father pretty well as well, as God has rules that you need to follow. There's no room for questioning the rules, even if they don't make sense to you, and there must be punitive measures taken for any disobedience. There isn't a focus on understanding why the rules are what they are. God's ways are above our ways, after all. We can't expect to understand the reasons behind everything he does, which apparently includes designing us in such a way that objectively the best parenting style is not the one that he demonstrates to us.
And that's just the reality, is we've got to go through hard times. Got to go through hard times in order to have godly character.
Again, though, all things are supposed to be possible through God, which means that God could have made us with godly character right from the get-go, without going through hard times. Also, what of infants who die? I assume you think they go straight to heaven, right? Do they not have godly character then? Why does God rob them of their chance of developing godly character?
That's just part of what happens. And the scripture, the Bible, abounds with this sort of teaching. This is thoroughly entrenched in the Christian belief system, is that your suffering brings about goods.
I mean, not really. The book of Job, the book of the Bible that most directly tackles the problem of evil, basically comes to the conclusion that being a good servant of God won't protect you from evil, nor will being evil guarantee that God sends divine retribution. You just have to accept your lot in life and recognize that God has ultimate power over everything, so you don't get to question him.
Okay, that's the soul-building theodicy. It would explain a lot of the suffering that goes on, but not all of it, I don't think. But the free will theodicy is just this, like that if you're going to allow people to make free decisions, you can't bar them from doing bad things.
The free will theodicy doesn't work unless you give up the idea that there is also free will in heaven. Because if it was impossible for God to create a world with free will and with no suffering, then free will cannot exist in heaven, because that would be the impossible to create world with free will and no suffering. There's also the fact that free will is not a biblical concept. Nothing in the Bible states that God's goal was to give anyone free will, and God on a number of occasions interferes with people's free will through numerous methods, including directly manipulating them, a la Pharaoh's hardened heart, deceiving them so that he can trick them into doing bad things that he can punish them for doing, a la Ezekiel 14, and if we include the logical conclusions of God's omniproperties, his very act of creating took away our free will. If God knows everything, past, present, and future, is all-powerful, and is the creator of everything, then that means that he knows with 100% certainty all of the downstream effects of all of his creative acts. What's more, Christians commonly interpret Psalm 139:13 as being generally applicable to everyone, meaning that God personally knits everybody together inside their mother's womb. He knows all of the choices that the person he is creating will make. He knows what changes he could make to the developing fetus that would alter these choices. He knows exactly how this person will interact with every other person they will meet, and how any potential changes to any of those people will impact all of the other people. With such knowledge and power, combined with his personal involvement in the creation of everyone, he effectively makes all of our choices for us by choosing how and when he will make us. The implication of the existence of the Christian God is that free will just does not exist, and as such, cannot be the reason that evil exists.
Like, that's not freedom. And so from the Garden of Eden to the book of Revelation, we see this freedom playing out. In the Bible, we see it in reality as well. That not all the evil, a lot of the evil that we see in the world, the most egregious kinds, are human-to-human evils or human-to-animal evils that are being done by somebody's free will or as a consequence of allowing free will. So this explains at least some of it.
It explains some of it because it's not capable of addressing what are known as the natural evils, pain and suffering due to natural disasters. The underwater earthquake that caused the tsunami in Japan in 2011 was not caused by human actions. It was just a thing that happened as a direct result of how God supposedly designed the Earth. God knew when he designed the Earth that that exact event would happen eventually, and he also knew how many people would be killed when it happened. He could have designed the Earth in a way where such things did not happen, but he chose not to. Natural evil, then, is more obviously directly the result of God's actions than human evil, as we don't even need to make any logical inferences about the nature of free will. It's as simple as God knows everything and knew everything when he made the Earth, so of course he knew that creating the way he did would result in a tsunami in 2011.
Another theodicy would be like the natural law theodicy, and that is the idea that I actually had an atheist ask me, Mike, why is it that I stub my toe? That's what I want to know. How is it that stubbing my toe, which hurts a lot, is somehow working together for good?
So while that is a bit of a silly question, it does serve to bring to light another aspect of the problem of evil, and it is related to the natural law. So again, in the Christian worldview, God designed everything, and that includes the laws that govern the universe. God made the universe such that some things are physically possible, and others are physically impossible. Being all-powerful, God could have designed a universe where it is physically impossible for humans to do significant evils to each other. They could still have the will to do these evils, but they're just unable to follow through. Just like I could have all the will in the world to fly by flapping my arms. But in the universe we live in, that's a physical impossibility for me. Now, I don't know exactly what such a universe would look like, but one aspect of it could easily be that things that don't need to cause physical pain just don't cause physical pain. We have pain receptors as a warning. Doing things that hurt can lead to damage, and if you don't take action to avoid them, the damage can become quite severe, potentially even permanent or life-threatening. But stubbing your toe is not something you really need a warning against. A mild discomfort to let you know that you just can't whip your foot in that direction without worrying about obstructions might be warranted, but the amount of pain that results from a toe stubbing is completely disproportionate to the damage that stubbing causes. So a universe that doesn't allow for that disproportionate pain to exist would be better.
And it may be that part of the reason why there's things, even some natural disasters and stuff, is partly, although it may have to do with cosmic battles and things that are going on. Yeah, I think that's a possibility. I just have very little discernment to know when they're happening.
Cosmic battles? How very polytheistic of you.
At any rate, it also can just be about natural law. That God wants a system of an ordered universe. He wants you to be able to do scientific experiments and have consistent results.
And he just didn't have either the knowledge or power required to create a universe where such things are possible without it also resulting in a bunch of horrendous natural disasters. Also, this essentially breaks down to, I made the universe in a way that would be guaranteed to painfully kill millions of people throughout history so that you could have the fun that comes out of figuring science stuff out. Yay! Oh, also, the act of figuring out some of that science stuff will kill a bunch of you too. Gotta work hard to figure out shit like germs and radiation, after all.
He wants you to be able to make choices and be able to predict the consequences. He wants you to live in a real world that really happens now.
So, when you eventually live in heaven, is that not a real world that really happens now? Will there be no discoveries to make in heaven? No learning that you could possibly do? The more detailed a picture I get of heaven, the worse it sounds. Apologists appeal to the things that Mike appealed to earlier in order to justify suffering and evil. It makes the good things feel better. But what about something like learning? Some of the best moments from my life are when I learned something new that made a bunch of stuff that I already knew click into place and really make sense. If heaven is a realm where you can't do science experiments, that implies that you either have full knowledge of how everything works already, or that it's impossible for us to comprehend how everything works, which means that at some point in eternity, you'll run out of things that it is possible for you to learn. And there are Christians who believe that you get all knowledge magically zooped into your brain when you enter heaven. So right from the get-go, the experience of learning new things, one of my favorite kinds of experience, is gone. And if I somehow end up in heaven, that will be something that I miss about this life. And can heaven really be perfect if I find myself pining for certain aspects of the mortal life again?
Right, not a make-believe world where you do something and God decides the outcome uniquely each time, where you pull the trigger and a marshmallow comes out because God doesn't want to let you shoot people. But rather, well, part of that's free will, but another part of it is just natural law, having consistent natural laws. But, for the same reason you stubbed your toe, for the same reason that mudslide happened, for the same reason there was a hurricane.
Are you really putting limits on God's creativity? God really couldn't think of a world where free will is possible, but the evil and suffering that we see in this world is just physically impossible? What a weak God you worship.
I am a god, you dull creature, and I will not be bullied by that.
Puny God. Christianity offers several different answers. Another one of them, and this might be kind of hinted at in the book of Job, is an answer called skeptical theism. And skeptical theism is a theodicy where you basically say, we're not in a position to know why God would allow different evils in the world. And so we should accept that we don't know and be okay with that.
Yeah, that's skeptical theism in a nutshell. But in my opinion, it points the skepticism in the wrong direction. The idea behind calling it skeptical is that we should be skeptical of our ability to figure out God's reasons for doing or not doing anything. But it amounts to a straight-up dismissal of the problem with no explanation, basically being an appeal to God's mysterious ways when a question becomes too difficult to answer. Instead of being skeptical of my ability to discern God's rationale for what he does or doesn't do, I'm skeptical of the claim that, given what we know of the God of Christianity, everything will work out for the best. Because Christianity flat out states that it does not. Well, at least not from the human perspective at any rate. 2 verses are all I need to show this, and they're 2 that I've already quoted today. That one from Matthew about how more people go to hell than heaven, and that one from Ecclesiastes about how it's better to never be born than to exist in the afterlife. I mean, strictly speaking, the ideas of heaven and hell hadn't solidified in the culture at the time that Ecclesiastes was written, so their idea of an afterlife was likely more similar to the Greek concept of Hades, neither good nor bad, just kind of an eternal meh. But I don't suppose the evolving view of the afterlife as the Bible progresses is really all that appealing to Mike, so he's stuck with Ecclesiastes stating flat out that never existing in the first place is better than heaven.
Would I, with my human limitations, with my cognitive limitations, with my experiential limits, with my observational limits, right, with my historical limits being stuck in just this little tiny time zone of my life, would I expect to understand why God allows a forest fire to kill animals in Australia?
If this God is a benevolent God who wants as many people to be saved as possible, as the Bible suggests in 2 Peter 3:9, then it would behoove him to provide us with an understandable explanation. So, yes, given that the problem of evil is something that causes people to not be saved, a God who wants as many people as possible to be saved should provide people with an adequate answer to the problem of evil without leaving them floundering.
Would I expect to understand that? Not, do I understand it? No. Would I expect to?
Yes. Given the properties that the Bible ascribes to God, we would expect God to provide us with adequate answers in order that as many people as possible could be saved.
Would I anticipate being able to figure out distant evils and hard problems and troubles that go on?
Wait, was the distance of the forest fire in Australia actually supposed to be a meaningful part of that equation? I'm not even sure what to do with this information. Like, surely a forest fire of a particular destructive capability is just as bad in North America as it is in Australia. Actually, come to think of it, the Australian one might be less bad because it's going to kill a lot of, evil monsters and shit, because Australia's full of those, right? Anyway, I'm not sure why distance would affect the moral calculation. I mean, eventually it gets to a point where it affects the calculation because there's nobody around to be harmed. Like the hurricane on Jupiter is way more distant than Australia, but to the best of my knowledge, there are no beings living on Jupiter that are harmed by the hurricane, so calling it bad or evil doesn't really make sense. And it's not really a function of distance, it's just a function of who's there.
Why this child we've been praying for is dying.
Well, given that Jesus said of those who believe in him that they will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover in Mark 16:18, that shouldn't actually be a possible scenario. No stipulations are given other than the person doing the healing is a believer in Jesus. It doesn't say that they will recover if it's the will of God or if the sick person has enough faith or whatever else it might be. It just flat out states that the believers will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover. This is supposed to be one of the signs that accompanies a true believer in Jesus. So praying for a sick child and that child not getting better should not be possible if you're a true Christian.
Would I expect to know the answer? And I think the answer here, generally speaking, is no.
If God is going to promise that his followers will have healing powers, and then his followers don't actually have those powers, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect an explanation for that.
I don't expect to know. And now if I don't expect to know, then how can me not knowing be evidence against God?
The thing is, a God who has a good reason to allow you to suffer but refuses to explain that reason is probably not the kind of God I would want to worship. I wouldn't consider such a being benevolent. Keep in mind here that benevolence is not about wanting to maximize good in some abstract ethereal sense. Benevolence is wishing well for others. To be omnibenevolent is to wish well on everyone, and not just wishing well, but wishing the best possible outcome for everyone. What reason could there possibly be to allow suffering for someone that you want the best possible outcome for, that explaining that reason in a way that they can understand would somehow worsen that outcome? I'd imagine that there are a lot of former Christians for whom the problem of evil is the primary cause of their deconversion. It stands to reason that at least some of them would either not have deconverted or would reconvert if an adequate explanation was given. So the conclusion here is that either God does not have an adequate explanation, or that he's not omnibenevolent, or again, that he just doesn't exist.
And I take a cumulative answer. I would say, yeah, all of these theodicies and more I find interesting. And I think what they do is they give us a lot of ways to answer the problem of evil, not just the logical problem, but even the sort of practical, experiential problem or the probabilistic problem of evil these are just other terms for different variations of the problem.
And all of these theodicies have flaws or are incomplete solutions. So to cover these flaws and the fact that they're incomplete, they wind up falling back on the mysterious ways answer that is skeptical theism.
Christianity not only gives you an explanation for evil, and a lot of ways to understand and deal with the fact that there's evil in the world.
Did you mean to say not only there? Or would that more properly have been Christianity does not even give you an explanation for evil? Like, given that the final theodicy is literally, I don't expect there to be an explanation for evil, how can you then turn around and say that Christianity gives you an explanation?
It also gives you something so wonderful. It gives you hope of a solution to the problem of evil, and this is understated when atheists talk about the problem.
It's understated because it's irrelevant. If the problem of evil demonstrates that Christianity is not true, then Christianity's solution of a magical happy place that you go to when you die is completely irrelevant. But even so, the fact of the matter is that the Bible explicitly states that God created evil in Isaiah 45:7. It explicitly states that it's better to never have been born than to live and then die. It explicitly states that the vast majority of people that God creates will wind up living in eternal torture with no hope of reprieve. So even if we take your magical happy place into account, most people will never see it. So the problem of evil just exists eternally for them. And on top of all that, God's initial design that allowed evil to enter the world in the first place seemed to have been set up specifically to accomplish that, rather than being a perfect scenario designed to maximize the benefit of the humans he created.
Not very subtle of the Almighty, though. Fruit tree in the middle of a garden with a don't touch sign. Well, put it on the top of a high mountain. Or on the moon.
Christianity says here's not only an explanation of the issue, perspective and wisdom on how to handle it, but here's a solution too.
If it actually provided a solution, you probably should have led with that, rather than explaining the imperfect theodicies that all wind up at a, well, God has a plan and we shouldn't expect to understand it anyway answer.
It's all part of the great plan. It's not for us to understand. It's ineffable.
The great plan's ineffable.
Exactly. It is beyond understanding and incapable of being put into words.
You feel this intense problem. You might even say the problem of evil is so bad that I would think if any religion's true, it better deal with this issue.
Oh, okay then. Since, by your own admission earlier, Christianity doesn't deal with it, since we apparently shouldn't expect God to provide us with an adequate explanation, Christianity is then also not true.
And Christianity deals with it on the explanation side, and it deals with it on the other side, which is the resolution side. So I can explain it, and I can resolve it in Christian faith.
If your explanation is we shouldn't expect there to be an explanation, can you really say that it deals with it on the explanation side?
And you just need to wait on him and trust in him and rest in him. And here's advice that you can't give as an atheist. There is just no hope. There is just no solution. There is just to suck it up. That's the way it is. And I think that makes atheism not only intellectually inferior, which we'll talk about in 2 seconds here, but also pragmatically inferior.
The hope of atheism lies in secular humanism. We recognize that this is the only life we get, so we try to make it as good as possible for as many people as possible. And yeah, I must admit that when accomplishing this means trying to convince people like Mike to actually be decent human beings, it does seem like a rather hopeless endeavor. But to then conclude that I don't like that fact, therefore there must be a God, is nothing more than an argument from consequences. Sure, I would love it if there were some supreme being that would ultimately make everything work out for the best for everybody. But there is no indication that such a being exists, and Christianity is pretty explicit about saying that it's not what God does, otherwise hell would be more like the Catholic idea of purgatory. You're punished in proportion to your bad actions, and once you've completed the punishment, you can move on into heaven. Of course, there would be problems with this system as well, but it's a better system than any that has eternal torture as an option. Like, maybe if your actions are heinous enough, you go through the punishment and then cease to exist? And what kind of punishment is it anyway? Like, is it just straight up torture? Sure, I'd say that stealing is wrong, but I don't think a thief deserves to be tortured, even a little bit, for their crime. I'm more in favor of a rehabilitative justice system than one based on retribution. Either way, my point is that humans are able to create a better conception of an afterlife system than God. Just watch The Good Place. Sure, it gets there in an over-the-top silly way, but it still gets there. And if mere humans can come up with a better idea of an afterlife than God, then what does that say about God?
Right? Christianity is better than atheism in that it doesn't leave people as a void.
And why do you think that atheism leaves people as a void? How does the absence of an afterlife leave you as a void in this life? If anything, it gives this life more potential to be fulfilling, because a knowledge that it's the only one you get can prompt you to accomplish more than you would if you thought this was just a trial run, with the afterlife being the real one. Thinking that this life is temporary and you're guaranteed eternal paradise after you die can lead you to complacency. I don't need to take this opportunity to travel the world. I'll have an eternity to do all the traveling I want in an even better world later. I don't need to reconcile with the LGBTQ child I kicked out of my home, because if it's God's will, they'll come back to Christianity eventually, and I'll have an eternity to spend with them. If it's not God's will, then so be it. I still get eternal paradise. Having the thought that this life is the only one you get in the back of your mind will guide you towards making better decisions than having the thought that the next life is the real one in the back of your mind.
But there's more. It actually gets worse, because the argument here that the atheist offers is it can actually backfire. It can actually spring back and backfire on the atheist, and here's the reason why. The problem of evil assumes one thing that doesn't make sense on an atheist worldview, which is evil.
Yeah, I knew it would wind up here eventually. Atheists don't have a supreme being that can dictate morality through a might makes right system. Therefore, we can't call bad experiences bad because they're just subjectively based. And who are we, mere subjective beings, to determine that our own subjective experiences are something that we don't like? I don't need God to tell me that I don't like stubbing my toe. I can figure that out all on my own.
Moral evil. That there's moral qualities of wickedness or evil or badness in different behaviors, and it assumes that that's a real thing going on in the world.
Okay, so the toe stubbing thing might not have a moral element, but like it or not, morality is subjective. As the subjects to which morality applies, we can subjectively figure out the things that we like and dislike, morally speaking, and so assign them labels of good and bad. If morality comes from God, then it's God's subjective likes and dislikes that are assigned the labels of good and bad. But the problem here is that the God of the Bible frequently seems to endorse moral positions that run counter to most of humanity's moral preferences. So when we have a moral disagreement with God, why should our moral opinions yield to God? Might makes right. He has the power to send you to hell to be tortured for eternity if you don't agree with him, so if you want that to not happen, you'd better agree with him.
And then you have to ask the question, how on earth is moral good and evil a real thing on atheism?
Because we have opinions about what things are morally good and morally bad. And as I've discussed in more detail in other videos, the existence of morality is entirely dependent upon the existence of subjects to which morality could apply, which makes morality subjective by definition, unless you think that morality exists independently of any subjects, in which case, since God is a subject in this sense, both atheism and Christianity get their morality from the same place, and this place is not the Christian God. Also, minor point, but it bothers me when apologists talk about things being on atheism, like atheism is some kind of drug or something. I don't even know if this is grammatically right or wrong, but it sounds wrong to me. And actually, as long as I'm talking about grammar, that's an excellent example of something that is a human construct based on nothing but our opinions, but can be objectively measured. Saying I is a atheist is objectively, grammatically wrong. Is it inherently wrong? No, it just goes against the rules of grammar that we have subjectively decided are a thing that exists. And as with morality, grammar changes over time. Addressing a group of people as you was grammatically wrong a few centuries ago. Ye was the correct way to do that. And actually, with the way you replaced thee, thou, and ye, English wound up lacking a second-person plural pronoun, leading us to say weird things like you guys, you all, or you lot when speaking to groups of people, instead of the more elegant ustedes of Spanish, vous of French, the nohi of Korean, and, well, the second-person plural of basically any language that isn't English. The linguistic standard that we use to measure the correctness and incorrectness of grammar has changed and is continuing to change, as several single-word alternatives to the clunky modified second-person pronoun serve to make it plural, like the yous of the New Yorker, the alia of the Creole, and the y'all of the South, to name a few. And if I were to make a linguistic prediction, y'all is going to eventually become the grammatically correct second-person plural, as it's permeating other English dialects faster than any of the others. I use it myself on occasion, usually for comedic effect, but often with my kids, I will use it unironically to make sure that they know I'm speaking to all of them instead of singling out one of them or using one of the clunkier two-word phrases. Anyway, what I'm getting at here is that we have what is obviously a subjectively derived set of rules by which we measure the objective correctness or incorrectness of our grammar. And these rules can change with culture, frequently with older generations not approving of the changes being made by the younger generations, but with the younger generations eventually winning and then repeating the cycle as their kids start modifying it for themselves.
Back in my day, all we needed to say when something was funny was lol. Get out of here with your raffle-coppered nonsense.
So my point here is to ask, does language not matter because we don't have an objective basis for grammar, syntax, or vocabulary? Can we not truly say what a particular word means in a particular context because we can't ground our language in an unchanging objective standard? Are the grammar police, who are inevitably going to be commenting about some small error that I made in my analysis, wrong to do so because the rules of grammar are subjectively agreed upon, were different in the past, and will be different in the future? And if you did not answer yes to any of those questions, then why would the same logic not apply to morality?
And was there not a more objectively correct way that I could have phrased those questions that wouldn't have certain members of my audience trying to count up the double negatives that come with no answers to see if I got my final analysis correct, despite the subjective origin of the rules of grammar? And finally, did I not throw that last question in there purely as a hedge against people potentially pointing out that I got it wrong so that I could say I did it on purpose to make a point? I'll never tell.
It's the paradox is the atheist saying, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in objective moral values and duties, yet what about the problem of evil?
With the language analogy, that's the equivalent of saying, I don't believe in an objective source of grammatical rules, so how can anyone say that any grammar is objectively right or wrong? Hell, even in the vernacular dialects that technically break a lot of the traditional grammar rules, they still have their own sets of rules that they follow by which a speaker of that dialect can recognize if the dialect is being used correctly. And there is discussion about how speakers of these various dialects should not be punished for not obeying the traditional grammar rules, because by the rules of their dialect, they are correct. The important thing is not which set of rules are obeyed, but whether or not the intended meaning is successfully conveyed from the author or speaker to their audience. This is one reason why I stopped responding to the creationist tendency to pluralize the word evidence incorrectly. I know what they mean when they say it, so even if it bothers me, it doesn't actually matter. The other reason is that there is a grammatically correct way to use the word evidences, so if I corrected them when they were actually using it correctly, the grammar police would then wind up in my comments correcting my correction. And while I do have a fairly good intuitive sense of correct and incorrect grammar, I know next to nothing about the specific rules of grammar. I had to look up whether you was the second or third person pronoun for this, because that's just not the kind of knowledge that I find even the slightest bit interesting, so spending time researching something like that just to be petty about something that didn't hinder my understanding of what they were saying is just tiresome. Okay, I think I've lost track of the analogy. Back to Mike!
And that's why the problem of evil remains a common source of doubt among religious people, or for religious people. And here's where I want to be super straight, right? Yeah, this absolutely is a common source of doubt for religious people. The problem of evil is probably the number one argument against God that I think people are persuaded by, impacted by, especially when they're going through really hard times and they can't explain it.
So there you go. You agree with me that plenty of people wind up leaving Christianity because of the problem of evil, which means that you should also agree with me that God providing an answer to the problem of evil that actually covers all the bases and makes sense rather than just appealing to mysterious ways would be better than leaving apologists to try and figure it out on their own and floundering in the process.
And my encouragement is this. I get that this is an effective and powerful argument that does draw some people away from God. Other Christians, it has like no effect on them, right? It just has no effect on them whatsoever. But some, it's really pulling them towards unbelief.
I'm actually kind of surprised that Mike would say it in that way. It's pulling them towards unbelief is a statement that cannot be true given Mike's other opinion that everyone believes in God deep down, and those who claim non-belief are just suppressing the truth in their unrighteousness. Unbelief is literally impossible in this view, so being pulled toward unbelief would then be a nonsensical statement. Now, maybe he meant it's pulling them towards suppressing the truth in their unrighteousness, but that's a weird way for the problem of evil to end. I don't like that bad things happen, so I will choose to suppress my knowledge of the being who will eventually fix it all? That would be a strange path to take indeed.
Rejecting God, or even just bitterness towards God.
Okay, I guess I paused too early. There's the hedging. It's not pulling them to unbelief, it's pulling them to bitterness toward God, so that eventually they'll have the Kevin Sorbo moment where a skilled Christian debater pushes them into admitting that they really just hate God because a bad thing happened to them personally.
Why do you hate God? Because he took everything away from me.
And to that I say, that's why evil's character building. This is part of the character building nature of evil. This is part of the real trials and real changes that go through our lives. But Christianity does offer intellectual answers to the problem of evil. It also offers emotional help to the problem of evil. But if you reject God, you lose both of those.
Well, you definitely don't lose the intellectual answer. The answer there is merely that the universe doesn't care about us, so that's why bad things happen. Emotionally, it really depends on how you look at it, but even if I grant that you lose the emotional help with the problem, that would amount to an argument from consequences. I like the idea that I'll be happy forever in the afterlife better than the idea that this is the only life I get, so the happier one must be true. And that's a very shallow way to look at it.
You can't explain the problem of evil's existence?
Yes, you can. Apologists just like to play word games to try and convince people that we would be unable to figure out that we don't like being robbed and murdered without God telling us that.
And you would seem like you'd have to deny it to be consistent. You can't offer any solution to the problem.
The solution, as I've already said, is to try and make life as good as possible for as many people as possible. It's not a solution that is likely to ever be implemented perfectly, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And on top of that, it's a goal that even Christians should be able to get behind, as helping the poor is a repeating theme throughout both the Old and New Testament. It's a shame that so many Christians seem to think that Jesus saying that you will always have the poor with you gives them an excuse to not bother helping the poor, because no matter how hard we try, there will always be poor people. When what Jesus was really saying there was that the people giving expensive things to him instead of using the money to help the poor is an okay thing to do, because there will always be poor people with you, but Jesus wouldn't always be there. Which honestly isn't a whole lot better than the don't help the poor people interpretation, and comes with the nice little bonus of seeming to deny the modern Christian picture of Jesus as being someone who is always with you.
And it ends up putting you in a worse position. Yet ironically, some atheists are proud of their lack of any hope. Like, he kind of boasts about having a hopeless perspective of the universe as if it's like tough-minded. But it's not. It's just not true.
I wouldn't say that he's showing a pride in his lack of hope. I'd say that it's more that he sees the hope that Christianity provides as a false hope, and so is proud of being strong enough to face reality instead of opting to believe a hopeful lie. Which, is not exactly how I would choose to look at it, but if Christianity isn't true, it's not exactly wrong either. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Maxine Stabile, who says, "You do realize chiropractic does help with back and neck pain, right? I have back and neck pain and chiropractic helps. I would appreciate you not lie about things you don't use. Just because you don't go to a chiropractor doesn't mean it doesn't help people." This was on a video where I made a one-off joke about chiropractic that essentially conflated it with astrology. I didn't talk about it in the video itself, but I did include a link in the description to an article on science-based medicine that provides a brief overview of what chiropractic is, its origin, and a plethora of links to other information that point out the problems with chiropractic. Basically, it began as something that is entirely pseudoscientific. D.D. Palmer adjusted the spine of a deaf man in 1895. Supposedly that adjustment cured his deafness, and from this, Palmer concluded that spinal manipulation could basically cure anything. And thus chiropractic was born. Today, there's an internal conflict among practitioners, with some who keep to the more scientific, manipulating the spine can make the spine feel better side of things, and others who see themselves as primary care doctors, essentially. They say that chiropractic can replace vaccination, you can use it to treat all sorts of completely unrelated issues, and essentially they carry on with the original pseudoscientific nonsense. Yes, there is some evidence to suggest that spinal manipulation is roughly equally effective for back pain as standard therapy, but it's not better. And the cost is about equivalent usually. So if it helps you with your pain, then that's fine. But I'd recommend going to see a physiotherapist rather than a chiropractor, as they can, and often do, provide similar spinal manipulation, but are significantly less likely to be quacks who think that back cracking will prevent the measles. Now, I appreciate the feedback and definitely want to know if I'm wrong about something, but please don't accuse me of lying. I consider that to be a very serious charge indeed, and I myself avoid accusing others of lying unless there is overwhelming evidence, as is the case for Matt Powell. Even here, where I said that Mike is misrepresenting the atheist content creators, I wouldn't say that he's lying about it. He probably watched the video and that is honestly what he got out of it, despite it being demonstrably wrong. And that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Science Nerd 7639, who says, "Vice Rhino, I may have found a problem with the source that you are using here. It is my understanding that the author of this paper, Dan Grauer, has revised his opinion in light of new evidence. Looks like it is not really true that no more than 15% of the human genome can be functional. For more info on this, take a look at the video on creation myths, If Encode is Right, Then Evolution is Wrong, by Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal, an evolutionary biologist. You will want to look into this so you don't have this mistake in future videos." Thanks for the update, I appreciate it. I was unaware of this follow-up work. I have watched the recommended video now and read through the more recent paper, and indeed, an updated stance on my part is necessary here. Short rundown, my usual claim is that, according to a 2017 paper by Dr. Dan Grauer, when you mathematically model the human mutation rate and cross-reference it with how many babies we have, then 85% of our genome, at a minimum, must be non-functional in order for there to be enough space for mutations to happen without wiping out the population through rapidly increasing mutational load. Well,
There was a 2020 follow-up paper by some researchers who disagreed. They ran their own model and found that when you account for the fact that a higher functional fraction of the genome will not only yield a large proportion of the population with severe deleterious mutations, but there will also be an increase in the expected maximum fitness for individual members of that population. The impact here is that it increases selection pressures, which will then work faster to weed out the deleterious mutations and fix the beneficial mutations in the population. This sort of balances things out. Yeah, more individuals will have bad mutations that could lead to extinction, but a handful of individuals will wind up with good mutations that work at the population level to balance out the impact of the bad mutations. So even with a high functional fraction of the genome, evolution still works. We've just wound up back at not knowing exactly how much of it is functional, but we figured out how evolution still works even if the functional fraction is high. And what makes this all the more significant is that Dr. Grauer, author of the first paper, was one of the peer reviewers on the second paper. He read it and recommended publication as is, which is one of the highest endorsements a scientist seeking publication can get. It is very rare for there to be no recommended changes. So remember how I said earlier that I enjoy being wrong because that means I get to learn something new? Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. I just learned a new thing that is really cool and got to see the scientific method working exactly how it's supposed to work. That's amazing! That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from all of Germany. Okay, not all of Germany, just the people in Germany who watch my videos, which is roughly 15,000 of you in any given month. I commented last time Winger brought up Nietzsche that the translation being quoted seemed to have plunked in a couple of words that didn't appear to be there in the original German, but with the caveat that I don't speak German, so I could be wrong. And within a half an hour of the video going live to members only, I already had multiple comments from Germans providing their linguistic analysis and all confirming that my suspicions were indeed correct. And more to my surprise, I haven't yet seen a single comment correcting my pronunciation of Nietzsche. I had a whole joke I was going to put here about how you shouldn't expect me to be able to say it before I can even figure out how to spell it, and ending by calling him Freddy Nitz to avoid even trying to say it right, but now I don't even get to do that because y'all didn't correct me, so I guess the only conclusion I can draw here is that I do indeed pronounce Nietzsche 100% perfectly in exactly the same way as a native German speaker would do. Okay, now that I've driven off my fourth largest source of viewers by country, it's time for the proper send-off. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Chaos1925, who says, "Ha ha. Well, I think I'll stop putting in effort listening to you here around 6 minutes in. Grifter, accusing Mike, the guy whose in-depth videos regularly go for hours, and none of yours are much over an hour long, and yet you accuse him of not putting in much effort. Here are some of the problems I found here within 6 minutes of your video. Mike was talking specifically about that little quote from Nietzsche, not all his work, and in this quote, Nietzsche was not talking about the lack in this life, but insulting Christianity with no proofs, just his own subjective edgy whining. Credit where it's due, you do link to the original video, but you do not play Mike's full clips here, and you mock him for being out of context, hypocrite. Before the clip you played, he had been talking about Nietzsche for about 14 minutes, and you know it. Blame the atheist website he was going off of, Allocation, if you want to blame anyone for taking that Nietzsche quote out of context there. Go ahead and get back to me about faith when you've studied ancient Greek, since you apparently don't know what synonyms are. There's a lot to unpack here, so I won't even mention me being a shit disturber who initially replied to this by saying, that's too long, I stopped reading, so I'll just assume it was you telling me how much you like my video, and so I'll just get straight to addressing the comment without telling you about that first. So first, Mike's videos go on for hours, and none of mine are much more than an hour long. Therefore, Mike is more in-depth and puts in more effort than I do, apparently. Well, the video of Mike's that I've responded to in this series was originally an hour and 23 minutes long. I edited out him repeating himself and going off on unrelated tangents, and that left us with 36 minutes of actual content to respond to. My response to those 36 minutes, once this video is done, have a total runtime of
3 hours and 55 minutes.
Even if we subtract the 36 minutes that Mike is speaking for in there, that leaves us with a significantly longer runtime on my end than on Mike's. So if we're just going by runtime, which as we saw in part 1, Mike himself certainly seems to think is an important metric,
hours and hours and hours of details, it's like 4 hours of content. Video down below that's over 3 hours.
Then I win. Also, a good chunk of Mike's content is him doing off-the-cuff rambling while live streaming, and then cutting the live streams down into shorter videos to release, which is also something that I do on my other channel, The Watering Hole, and I can tell you that that is way easier to do than to do one of my scripted videos. One scripted video of mine typically takes me the whole week minus Wednesday to complete. 2 days spent on scripting and research, half a day for filming, and a day and a half of editing. Wednesday, the only day that is not taken up by this, is the day that I spend preparing for my live stream and editing the clips of my previous live stream. So with the live stream method, I can pump out 2 to 3 hours of content, which then gets doubled as everything is released twice, once in the stream and once in a clip, so that's 4 to 6 hours of content for 1 day's work. A scripted video is a half an hour to an hour of content for 4 days' work. And Mike doesn't even take the time to Google simple terms that he doesn't understand in order to make sure he's correct, all while he sits there reading from a web browser, presumably connected to the internet since he's usually also streaming it.
And I don't remember what a philologist is. Is that like a philosopher? I mean, the study of philo could be love, philosophy, wisdom, I don't know.
With regards to the Nietzsche quote, I don't see your problem with that. I wasn't looking at all of Nietzsche's work. I was looking at enough of his work to provide adequate context for the quote that Mike was specifically discussing, and reading the writings of other philosophers and theologians who were discussing that work and considered it a work of genius, not his own subjective edgy whining. Mike didn't even bother to learn the context. He just assumed that on its own, it was enough. As to my not playing his full clip, I went back and watched the original. As I said, I cut this down to one 36-minute video, and I did that before I responded to all of them, so it's entirely possible that I accidentally cut something out that was relevant, though 14 minutes of discussion on that specific topic seems a bit excessive. So the quote being discussed here begins at about the 48-minute mark in Mike's original video. In the 14 minutes before that, Nietzsche is discussed from about the 33-minute and 15-second mark to the 34-minute and 21-second mark. After that, most of the time is spent on the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence statement, which has nothing to do with Nietzsche. Now, in fairness, the section of the blog that this was dealing with was called Friedrich Nietzsche, but it had little to nothing to do with Nietzsche, as it was mostly the author misunderstanding another decontextualized quote from Nietzsche. But in fairness to me, if you actually watched the first 6 minutes of my video, you would have heard me say that this was part 3 in a series, and that there's a playlist for the other parts, so you would have been able to see me cover that section thoroughly in part 2. So no, I don't think it's hypocritical of me to say that Mike isn't bothering to look into the context of the statements he is criticizing, because while I did chop up Mike's video, I'm confident that I left all the important stuff in. Though, if you watch it and think that I missed something critical, I would be happy to address that. And yes, I do blame the allocation site for taking it out of context, not Mike. Again, if you actually did watch the first 6 minutes of my video and paid attention, you might have noticed that my criticism of Mike was not that he took it out of context, it was that he didn't even bother to attempt to figure out what it might have been saying in context, instead dismissing it as baseless mockery when theologians and philosophers have been discussing and debating about it for over a century. On top of that, I know that before the 6-minute mark, I explained how it's a concept that was an echo of the words of Jesus when he tells people to store up treasures in heaven, not on earth. Focus on the next life, not on this one. So even without examining context, Mike still could have given it a more serious treatment, but he chose instead to dismiss it without putting any thought into it, and therein was my main problem with how he responded to it. As to the ancient Greek synonyms thing, yeah, I kind of blew off that point, but I do have other videos where I discuss it in more detail, and given that each wrong thing Mike says takes a shit ton of research on my part in order to fully explain why the thing he said was wrong, I had to choose my battles, and I decided that that wasn't an important one in the moment. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Stream with my partner's on hiatus until she's done school at the moment, so none of that anymore. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Tarika or Tarika Chamberlain, and all the rest, who are the hours of content that make my channel credible to the bottom-rung apologists. If you'd like to actually be a mostly useless metric, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my PO Box address is in the description. See you next time! This is a waste of space on my SD card. I should stop recording, but I'm too lazy. Avoid the equestrian altogether. Avoid the equestrian. The equestrians in Equestria.
How do you account for moral values and duties? You're saying I'm immoral, I'm a good person. I'm not saying that. I hate you.
No, sir. I didn't see you playing with your dolls again. Good!
Thanks to the Haggis God for the amazing Rhino figurine that he sent me. This guy, right here. Pretty nifty. Pretty nifty. And since the postage on the package said that it originated in Kent, I felt it only fair to compose a thank you limerick. There was a kind person in Kent, from whom this rhino was sent. It fits up my bum with the ease of my thumb, but the sharp bits I'd give up for Lent. Yes, I know, I'm the next Shakespeare. You're welcome. Are you still a flying fox? No? Yeah. Yeah? I think this is echolocation. Guess who just recorded half the video before remembering to put the microphone on my shirt, and so it sounded far away. Hello and welcome to my channel. And now I have to redo it. Sam Harris literally just said the exact... What?
Where's my Buddhist cookbook?
Your Buddhist cook... Okay, I think it's behind me. Just a sec. This one?
Yep, that's the one.
Okay.